Hey guys, tonight we are diving into a story that sounds completely ridiculous on the surface, but which offers a fascinating, slightly bewildering glimpse into a past where the lines between nature, superstition, and sheer desperation were blurred almost beyond recognition. Imagine this: you're standing in a field, the kind where the mud sucks at your boots with every step, and the wind whipping past isn't just cold, it feels angry. It's been raining for weeks, or maybe the frost bit the crops again last night, and your stomach is cramping with a familiar gnawing emptiness. Survival isn't a given, it's a daily wrestling match against forces you barely understand. And in this world facing the relentless, unforgiving weather, you look over at your cow, placidly chewing its cud, and you think, yep, that's it. It's definitely her fault. You probably won't survive this journey through 17th century weather beliefs without questioning a few things about human logic, but stick with it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Right, so you're living in, say, rural England, or perhaps parts of continental Europe, sometime in the 1600s. Life is, to put it mildly, tough. Not, oh, I missed my bus tough, or oops, my phone battery died tough. We're talking medieval levels of tough, just slightly updated with slightly better hats. You live on the land tied to its rhythms and its absolute unyielding demands. Your days are dictated by the sun, the seasons, and crucially the weather. And the weather in the 17th century, well, it was having a bit of a moment. A bad moment. This era falls squarely within a period historians now call the Little Ice Age. Don't picture glaciers sweeping down Main Street or anything dramatic like that, but think colder winters, wetter summers, more unpredictable and violent storms, and generally just less pleasant conditions for growing food. Rivers that rarely froze before were now solid enough to hold fairs and market stalls on their icy surfaces. The River Thames in London had famous frost fairs. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant existential threat. A late frost could kill your entire year's crop of barley or wheat. Too much rain at harvest time could rot it in the fields. A savage hailstorm could shred everything in minutes. And if your crops failed, you starved. Or at best, you went hungry and cold for months until the next year's harvest, if you were lucky enough to survive that long. The margin for error was incredibly thin. You lived on a knife's edge, and the weather was the hand constantly jiggling the knife. In this world where you are utterly dependent on the fragile balance of nature, and nature seems actively hostile, you start looking for explanations. And perhaps, just perhaps, something or someone to blame. Because if something has a cause, maybe you can do something about it. Maybe you can appease it, fight it, or at least understand why this terrible thing is happening to you year after relentless year. Now you might think the obvious culprits would be divine forces, God's wrath, the devil's work, maybe angry nature spirits, if that was more your local flavor. And absolutely, those were huge parts of how people understood the world back then. Religion and deeply ingrained superstition were the lenses through which pretty much everything was viewed. If the harvest failed, maybe you hadn't prayed hard enough, or maybe a witch had cast a spell. That makes a certain kind of sense within the worldview of the time. What feels truly bizarre, though, is that amidst the prayers and the fears of dark magic, a finger of blame was also pointed squarely and persistently at the humble cow. Yes, the cow. The very creature that was often your most valuable asset. The source of milk, butter, cheese, manure for your fields, and eventually meat and leather. The beast that represented stability, potential food security, and even a form of wealth. That animal chewing away in the pasture was thought by a significant number of people to be a direct contributor to the foul weather plaguing their lives. It sounds utterly absurd to our modern ears, conditioned by meteorology and climate science. Blaming a cow for a thunderstorm, it's like blaming your toaster for the internet going down. But in the 17th century, in the thick of the Little Ice Age, this idea took root. Imagine the scene again. The sky is a bruised purple wind, whipping up dust and straw. You're worried about the coming storm ruining the hay you've just cut. And you look at your cow, perhaps one with particularly prominent horns, standing stolidly against the rising wind. And somewhere in the back of your mind, an old tale, a whispered piece of folklore resurfaces. A story you heard from your grandmother, or perhaps from a neighbor across the village. Something about how cows, especially certain cows, or cows behaving in certain ways could draw down the rain, stir up the wind, or even conjure hail. This wasn't necessarily a universal belief held by every single person in every single village across Europe, but it was widespread enough and persistent enough to be recorded in various texts, folklore collections, and even some early scientific or philosophical writings that sought to debunk such peasant superstitions. It wasn't just a quaint, isolated belief. It was a functional explanation within the framework of people's lives. If the cow could cause the weather, then perhaps there was something you could do about the cow to stop the weather. It offered a potential point of intervention in a world that otherwise felt overwhelmingly subject to uncontrollable forces. So this is where we start our journey tonight in the cold, muddy fields of the 17th century, grappling with a harsh climate, profound vulnerability, and a worldview where the actions, or even just the presence, of your most valuable animal could be seen as a direct cause of the sky's fury. It's a strange, almost comical notion from our perspective, but for the people living through it, it was a serious, albeit bizarre attempt to make sense of a capricious and often cruel world. You relied on your cows to live, and yet you suspected them of trying to kill you with a freak snowstorm in June. Talk about a complicated relationship. So you're there shivering slightly in your rough woolen tunic, watching your cow chew its cud, this weird accusation forming in your mind. But why cows? Of all the things to blame, pesky crows eating the seeds, blight on the wheat, the neighbor who looked at you funny yesterday. Why the creature that literally keeps you alive? Well, to understand that you have to step even further back from your modern brain and into the head of someone living in the 17th century. Their world wasn't just different technologically, it was fundamentally different in how it was perceived. Nature wasn't seen as a collection of inert objects governed by abstract, predictable laws of physics. Oh no. Nature was alive. It was vibrant, interconnected, and often capricious, filled with spirits, influences, and hidden powers. Think of it less like a clockwork mechanism and more like a vast, unruly garden where everything is subtly influencing everything else, in ways you can't fully grasp, but you absolutely feel. This is the realm of animism where even seemingly inanimate objects or natural phenomena can have a spirit or a consciousness, and where living beings, particularly ones as powerful and essential as a cow, are deeply intertwined with the fabric of the world around them. In this worldview, it's not such a giant leap to think that a powerful animal intimately connected to the earth and the cycles of life and death might also have some sway over the sky. You see, without weather satellites, Doppler radar, or even a basic understanding of atmospheric pressure fronts, which, let's be honest, most of us still just nod along to when a meteorologist explains it. Predicting or understanding the weather was a matter of observation, folklore, and guesswork mixed with prayer. People watch the sky, they watch the plants, and they watch their animals. And animals with their seemingly intuitive connection to the natural world were often seen as harbingers or even agents of change. Birds flying low before a storm, pigs carrying straw in their mouths. These were noted behaviors, and while modern science can explain them based on air pressure or instinct in the 17th century, it was easy to interpret them through a magical lens. If animals could predict the weather, maybe they could also influence it. Enter the concept of sympathetic magic. This is a thread that runs through a lot of historical folk beliefs. The basic idea is that things which are alike or which have been in contact can influence each other, often at a distance. Think of voodoo dolls, or the idea that healing a weapon that caused a wound would help the wound heal faster. Yes, that was a thing. So how might this apply to cows and weather? Well, cows are large, powerful animals. They have horns, sometimes seen as symbols of power, fertility, or even connection to heavenly or underworld forces. Their breath is warm and visible in the cold air, perhaps seen as a form of visible spirit or energy leaving the body. They are deeply connected to the earth through grazing and to the sky through their dependence on rain for grass. In some traditions, cattle have mythological links to sky gods or earth goddesses associated with fertility abundance, but also sometimes with primal untamed forces. A quirky tidbit here in some European folklore: cows were associated with witches and their ability to steal milk, but also occasionally with weather manipulation, suggesting a broader perceived link between these animals and supernatural or uncontrollable natural events. Consider the daily life of a farmer. You spend hours upon hours around your cows. You notice everything they do. You see them gather together before a storm, or maybe they low in a certain way when the wind picks up. You see them switch their tails furiously in the muggy air before a downpour. Some of these behaviors, as we now know, are genuine reactions to atmospheric changes. Cows do tend to lie down more when rain is coming because insects are less active closer to the ground. But when you don't understand air pressure or insect behavior, you might interpret the sequence differently. The cows lie down. And then it rains. Perhaps the lying down wasn't a reaction to the coming rain, but a magical action that caused the rain. It's a classic case of correlation being misinterpreted as causation filtered through a belief system that saw agency and influence everywhere. Furthermore, think about how unpredictable life was. When crops failed, or a storm destroyed your house, or lightning struck your barn, you needed an explanation. It wasn't just random bad luck. That was too terrifying. You needed a reason, something to grasp onto. If the reason was something tangible like the neighbor's evil eye, or a cow's supposed weather-making ability, then at least you had identified a potential cause, even if it was a magical one. This offered a bizarre form of comfort and, crucially, a potential target for action. If the cow was causing the weather, maybe you could do something to the cow. A ritual, a blessing perhaps, even something more drastic, to stop it. It gave people a sense of agency in a world where they had very little control. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were held as absolute literal truths by everyone, or if they were more nuanced, perhaps metaphorical ways of explaining misfortune, or rituals performed out of habit, and a general sense that it was better to be safe than sorry when dealing with powerful unseen forces. Were people genuinely terrified of their cow conjuring a hailstorm like a furry, four-legged Gandalf? Or was it more of a traditional explanation, like saying, "The spirits are restless tonight"? The answer probably lies somewhere in the messy, complicated middle, varying from person to person, in village to village. But the fact that these beliefs were recorded and discussed suggests they were a real part of the cultural landscape. Maybe a specific cow was seen as unlucky because every time something bad happened, that cow was nearby. Maybe a farmer had a run of terrible weather after acquiring a new cow, and the story spread. In a small, close-knit community, oral traditions and shared beliefs held immense power. A rumor, a strange occurrence attributed to an animal, could quickly become accepted wisdom, especially if it seemed to offer an explanation for inexplicable hardship. The collective anxiety caused by the Little Ice Age's relentless bad weather likely amplified these fears, and the need for scapegoats, even bovine ones. So the belief wasn't just pulled from thin air. It was likely a convergence of several factors, a worldview that saw nature as alive and interconnected. The lack of scientific meteorological understanding, the principle of sympathetic magic, ancient folklore, connecting cows to powerful natural forces, and practical daily observations of animal behavior, misinterpreted through a magical lens. Add to this the desperate need for explanations and a sense of control in a precarious world, and suddenly blaming Bessie for the blizzard starts to make a strange, sad kind of sense. It wasn't logical by our standards, but it was a functional belief within the framework of their reality. You lived and died by the weather, and you watched the animals you lived with constantly. Of course, you'd start to connect the dots, even if they formed a picture that looks utterly bonkers to you sitting comfortably today. So you're not just blaming your cow because you're bored, right? It's part of this whole tangled web of trying to understand and manipulate a world that frankly seems determined to make your life miserable. And blaming cows wasn't the only trick up the 17th century sleeve when it came to the weather. Oh no. If you were trying to figure out if you could get the hay in before the sky dumped on you, or praying you would get rain because your crops were wilting, you had a whole catalog of signs, omens, and rituals to rely on. Think of it as the original, highly unreliable, and often frankly bonkers weather app. You'd wake up, step outside, and immediately start reading the world around you. The sky was your primary textbook. Red sky at night shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning shepherd's warning. This is a classic, right? And it's actually got a bit of science to it. dust particles in the atmosphere catching the setting or rising sun. But for every somewhat sensible observation like that, there were dozens of others that felt more mystical. Was there a ring around the moon? Bad sign often meant rain was coming. Were the clouds shaped like a mare's tail, wind incoming? Were they low and dark and scudding fast, brace yourself? You were constantly scanning, interpreting, trying to find patterns in the chaos. And it wasn't just the sky. You'd look at the animals, not just your potentially problematic cows. Swallows flying high, good weather. Flying low, rain, or a storm is brewing again, a kernel of truth here. As insects, they feed on fly lower in humid, low-pressure air. Frogs croaking loudly, rains on the way. Bees staying close to the hive. Probably going to rain. Even your own body might be a weather vane. Did your old war wound ache? Was that twinge in your knee playing up? Ah, a storm must be approaching? It sounds funny to us, but when you're so intimately connected to the rhythms of the land and your own physical state, these things become important indicators. It was a holistic, if wildly inaccurate system. Beyond predicting, there was the desire to influence. If prediction was impossible or suggested disaster, maybe you could do something about it. This is where rituals came in. You might hold processions carrying religious icons or relics through the fields praying for rain or for the rain to stop. Churches often had specific prayers appointed for good weather or for relief from storms. Sometimes things got weirder. Folk remedies and charms were common. Maybe you'd throw a specific stone into a well to ask for rain or carry a particular plant. In some places, people would even perform actions in sympathetic magic opposition to what they wanted, like scattering ashes to prevent snow or spitting into the wind to calm it. You were trying anything and everything, a desperate gamble against the elements. A mainstream historical fact tying into this almanacs became increasingly popular throughout the 17th century. While they contained practical information like planting times and tide tables, they were also filled with astrological predictions and often included folk weather signs and prognostications based on the moon phases or the positions of planets. People would consult these widely available books, blending practical observation with what we'd now consider superstition. They weren't just entertainment. They were genuinely used as guides for living and farming, reflecting the widespread belief that the cosmos and terrestrial events were interconnected. Now, for a quirkier tidbit, in some parts of Europe, there were beliefs that certain saints had influence over specific weather phenomena. Saint Barbara, for example, was often invoked against lightning and storms, particularly by miners and artillerymen. People would light candles or offer specific prayers to these saints, hoping to secure favorable weather conditions or protection from meteorological disaster. It wasn't just general prayer. It was targeted, specific spiritual lobbying based on established folklore about the saints' powers. It's like having a Rolodex of divine specialists for different types of bad weather. Oh, a thunderstorm, better call Saint Barbara. Need sunshine, let's try Saint Medard. This reliance on signs, omens, rituals, and even saintly intervention wasn't seen as separate from life. It was life. It was how you navigated uncertainty in a world without scientific understanding of atmospheric processes. It was an attempt to find meaning and exert some form of control, however illusory, in the face of powerful, indifferent natural forces. The belief that your cow's behavior could affect the weather slots right into this context. It wasn't a standalone delusion. It was one specific manifestation of a broader worldview that saw connections and influences everywhere, often attributing agency to things that science would later explain as inanimate or purely instinctual. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these folk beliefs and rituals was a direct consequence of the increased hardship caused by the Little Ice Age, or if the Little Ice Age simply exacerbated and highlighted existing older traditions. Were people clinging more desperately to these methods because the weather was consistently worse and less predictable? Or was this just how they always dealt with weather, and the bad weather simply meant their methods seemed to fail more often? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, but the link between environmental stress and the potential increase in superstitious practices is a fascinating point of debate. Imagine you've done everything right. You've planted your seeds according to the almanac. You've watched the sky like a hawk. You've seen the swallows flying high for days. You've even said the extra prayer to Saint Swithin, another weather saint. Look him up if you're feeling adventurous. And then boom, a sudden unexpected hailstorm flattens your entire crop. You need an explanation. It can't just be random chance. That's too unbearable. It must be something. Maybe you missed a sign. Or maybe something closer to home, something you interact with every single day has been actively working against you. And that's where the gaze could fall back on your bovine companions. They were right there, part of your immediate world, powerful and essential. These methods of weather prediction and influence, from sky watching to saint calling, highlight just how much the weather dominated everyday life and thought. It wasn't just background noise, it was an active participant in your survival. And within this intense focus on the capricious nature of the atmosphere, animals, particularly large vital ones like cows, were naturally placed under scrutiny. Their health, their behavior, their very presence became entangled with the mysterious forces that controlled the sun, rain, and wind. You weren't just managing livestock, you were managing potential weather agents. It adds a whole new layer of stress to, are the cows healthy? Now you also have to wonder, are they plotting? So blaming the cows wasn't an isolated act of madness. It was woven into a rich, complex tapestry of non-scientific attempts to understand and control the natural world. It was one color in a very crowded palette of folk beliefs, rituals, and observations that defined how people interacted with the weather in an era before meteorology was even a twinkle in a scientist's eye. You lived by these signs, you tried to appease the forces you couldn't see, and sometimes when all else failed and disaster struck you, looked for a tangible, if unlikely, culprit among your own animals. Okay, so you've been watching the sky, reading the sheep, checking your knees for aches, maybe even throwing a lucky stone into a well, and still the hail hammered down or the drought withered everything to dust. You've tried all the usual tricks, all the standard methods of reading nature's mood or trying to coax it into submission, and they failed, utterly, devastatingly. When your livelihood, your family's survival depends entirely on the whims of the sky, and those whims are consistently brutal and unpredictable, especially during a rough patch like the Little Ice Age where the weather was genuinely awful more often than not, you get desperate. And desperation leads you to look closer to home for answers, or perhaps for blame. And who is closer to home, more vital to your existence, and more constantly present than your cows? Think about it. Your cattle are your walking, breathing bank account. They provide milk, butter, cheese, essential food. They produce calves, increasing your herd and future wealth. Their manure fertilizes your fields, making future crops possible. They might even pull your plow. They are utterly central to the agricultural economy you inhabit. You spend hours with them every single day, tending to them, milking them, moving them. They are large, powerful animals, and sometimes, let's be honest, they behave in ways that are utterly baffling or frustrating. When something terrible happens that you can't explain, like the weather turning viciously against you, and your cows are right there, part of the equation of your daily struggle. It's perhaps less of a leap than it seems at first glance to draw a connection. They are always there, a constant in a world of atmospheric chaos. But why cows specifically? It wasn't just about proximity or economic importance, though those certainly helped put them in the frame. There was a deeper, more pervasive belief system at play in the 17th century that positioned animals, particularly livestock, in a liminal space between the mundane world and the spiritual or supernatural realms. It was widely believed that animals were more sensitive to supernatural forces than humans were. They could sense evil, detect witches, and were often thought to be susceptible to charms, curses, or demonic influence. If you thought evil forces like witches could manipulate the weather, and many people absolutely did during this era of intense witchcraft panics, and you also believed animals could be tools or victims of these forces, it wasn't a huge jump to think your cow might be involved. Maybe your cow was possessed by a spirit intent on ruining the weather. Or maybe a witch had cast a spell on the cow, not just to make it sick or stop giving milk, but specifically to use it as a conduit for bad weather. Think of it, a witch curses your cow, and suddenly every time that particular cow twitches its tail or lows in a certain way, a dark cloud appears on the horizon. It sounds wild to us sitting here with our weather satellites and meteorological models, but in a world where the invisible hand of the supernatural was seen everywhere, This kind of explanation offered a terrifying, yet oddly logical framework for understanding inexplicable misfortune. The cow wasn't necessarily acting maliciously on its own. It was being acted upon. And there were specific tangible things about cows that might have fueled these suspicions. Milk, for instance, was a substance imbued with immense symbolic and practical significance. It was pure life-giving, the product of the earth and the animal. But milk also goes bad. It curdles, it sours. Sometimes cows produce milk that looks strange. Maybe it was tinged with blood or didn't churn into butter properly. In an age without understanding of bacterial contamination or animal diseases, bad milk wasn't just a spoiled product. It was often interpreted as a sign of malevolent influence or ill omen. If the milk was bewitched, could the animal producing it also be bewitched in ways that affected more than just the dairy pail? If the milk was bad, maybe the cow itself was radiating a kind of badness that extended to the atmosphere. It's a short, frightening step from "my cow's milk is off" to "my cow is cursed, and that's why it hailed yesterday." You also had their behavior to consider. Cows are creatures of habit, generally placid, but they do react to their environment. Before a storm, animals can behave differently. They might get restless, seek shelter earlier, or make different noises. If your cow suddenly seemed agitated, pacing, or lowing unusually, and then a terrible storm rolled in, it was easy to interpret that not just as the cow reacting to atmospheric changes, but somehow being connected to them, perhaps even summoning them unintentionally, or as a sign that something was supernaturally amiss with the animal that was now manifesting as bad weather. Their unease became a portent, or worse, a symptom of a deeper problem linked to the weather itself. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the sheer prevalence of accusations of maleficium, harmful magic, during the 17th century witchcraft trials. While many accusations focused on harm to people or crops directly harming livestock, causing them to sicken, die, or cease producing milk was a very common charge against suspected witches. If a witch could blight your cattle or spoil their milk through magic, it wasn't a huge logical leap in the mindset of the time to think they could also use those same highly significant animals as focal points or agents for other types of harm, including weather manipulation. The cow was already established in the popular imagination as a potential target and vector for witchcraft-related harm. Extending that to weather felt almost natural within that terrifying worldview. And here's a quirkier tidbit related to this belief in animal sensitivity. There are historical accounts, particularly from witchcraft trial records in some parts of Europe, that describe methods used to test animals suspected of being bewitched. These might involve using counter charms, applying certain herbs or substances, or observing the animal's reaction to religious items. If an animal behaved strangely during these tests, it was taken as further proof of supernatural interference. The fact that people develop specific rituals and tests for potentially bewitched animals highlights just how seriously the idea of livestock being supernaturally compromised was taken. It wasn't just idle gossip. It was a problem requiring active, sometimes elaborate intervention. Historians still argue whether the focus on animals like cows and weather-related blame was primarily a projection of human anxiety onto a valuable resource, or if it genuinely stemmed from deeply ingrained ancient pagan or folk beliefs about animal spirit connections that persisted despite Christianization. Was it a new phenomenon exacerbated by the pressures of the Little Ice Age and witchcraft panics, or a continuation of older, more fundamental ways of viewing the natural world and the creatures within it? It's a thorny question, trying to unpick practical observation, economic anxiety, Christian theology, and older folk magic in the historical record. So you've got your sick cow, or your cow giving bad milk, or the cow that seems unusually agitated. Your crops have failed, the storm ruined your harvest, the drought killed your seedlings. You've tried praying, you've tried rituals, you've watched the signs, and nothing worked. The official explanation might be the wrath of God, but that doesn't help you eat. Blaming an invisible witch you can't prove is difficult, but the cow is right there. It's a tangible being, something you can interact with, something whose condition or behavior seems off. Attributing the weather disaster to the cow, perhaps as a victim of dark magic, or even in some confused folk logic as an unwitting agent of it, provides a concrete target for your fear and frustration. It gives you something specific to point at something that feels connected to the disaster in a way that distant clouds or the seemingly random hail simply do not. It's a dark form of logic born of desperation and a worldview saturated with belief in the supernatural. The cow, so central to your survival, so often seen as susceptible to spiritual forces, becomes the scapegoat. It's not just a sick animal, it's a compromised animal. And that compromise in a deeply interconnected and magical view of the world can extend its negative influence beyond its own health to the very sky above your fields. The blame might manifest in harsh treatment of the animal attempts to cure it of its presumed supernatural affliction, or even in extreme cases, killing the animal to remove the perceived source of the weather curse. It adds a truly tragic layer to the already difficult lives of these farmers. Not only are they battling the elements, but they might also turn on the very animals that are essential to their survival. Talk about biting the hand that feeds you, or I guess milking the udder that curses you, doesn't quite have the same ring. This wasn't just a simple isolated superstition, it was a belief plugged into a larger network of ideas about the cosmos, the divine, the demonic, and the interconnectedness of everything from the health of an animal to the falling rain. It was a way of making sense of an unpredictable, harsh reality, a way of finding a focal point for the chaos. And your poor cow, standing patiently chewing its cud, became that focal point, a quiet bovine lightning rod for the anxieties of a world struggling to understand why the sky seems so determined to ruin them. So you've looked at the cow. You've seen its twitching tail, heard its strange lowing, maybe noticed its milk is off, or it's just generally acting wrong. And you've connected these bovine peculiarities in your mind to the hailstorm that flattened your barley, or the persistent drought that's cracking the soil around your wilting cabbages. The cow is involved. It's part of the problem. And this is where the truly nasty turn happens, is the cow acting alone. Is Bessie just having a bad weather-cursing day all by herself? Probably not in the terrified, supernatural, saturated mindset of the 17th century. If the cow is acting under a curse, if it's a conduit for dark magic, then there must be a hand guiding that magic. And that hand almost inevitably belongs to a human. This is where the focus shifts subtly but terrifyingly from the four-legged scapegoat to the two-legged suspect. If your cow is the source of the weather, woes, maybe it's because you, its owner, are a witch. Or just as likely, if your neighbor's cow seems particularly troublesome right before a frost kills your fruit trees, maybe they are the witch using their animal as an instrument of their malice. The cow in this scenario becomes less the culprit and more the evidence. Its strange behavior, its sickness, its failure to produce, these aren't just signs of a bewitched animal, they're potential proof that the person who owns it is dealing in dark arts. Think about the dynamics of village life. You live cheek by jowl with the same people your entire life. You depend on each other, sure, but you also have grudges. Maybe someone owes you money. Maybe there was a dispute over a boundary stone last spring. Maybe their chickens got into your garden, or maybe you just don't like the look of them. Add crushing economic hardship, the existential dread of the Little Ice Age messing with the harvest year after year, and a pervasive, genuine fear of witchcraft fueled by sermons and official pronouncements, and that simmering tension is a tinderbox. When the sky opens up and ruins everything, and their cow mood funny yesterday, well, the dots start connecting themselves in very dangerous ways. This transition from blaming the animal to blaming its owner wasn't random. It was deeply embedded in the logic of how witchcraft was understood. Maleficium. Remember that term from the last section? The idea of harmful magic causing sickness in people or animals, ruining crops, spoiling food. These were classic accusations hurled against suspected witches. Causing bad weather was another frequent charge, often seen as a form of large-scale maleficium against the entire community or region. If a witch could blight your potato patch with a curse whispered at midnight, why couldn't they conjure a storm cloud with a ritual performed over their own livestock? The cow, being such a central, valuable, and symbolically charged animal, was the perfect vector for this kind of thinking. If a witch wanted to harm a neighbor attacking their most valuable asset, their cow, was a direct hit. And if that attack on the cow somehow also manifested as wider atmospheric chaos, even better from the witch's hypothetical, terrible perspective. So you see your neighbor's cow acting strangely, its milk is curdling. Maybe it's gotten thin, and simultaneously, the unpredictable, destructive weather hits. Your mind, pre-wired by belief in witchcraft and desperate for an explanation, links the two. The sick cow isn't just a victim. It's a sign, perhaps even an agent of the neighbor's malevolence. It's like finding a cursed object on someone's property. It points the finger directly at the owner. Except the cursed object is alive, eats grass, and has a tail. There were various ways this suspicion could manifest, often starting small and escalating. Maybe you just mutter about it to your spouse. Did you see Old Man Hemlock's Bessie yesterday? Looked peaky, it did. And then this morning, the frost took the early peas. Coincidence? I think not. These whispers spread. Other villagers who've had their own misfortunes, maybe a child fell sick, or a churn of butter refused to set start, connecting their woes to the same neighbor and perhaps to the same cow. The cow's condition becomes shared evidence, a physical symptom of a spiritual or magical disease originating with the owner. It's a terrifying example of how confirmation bias can run absolutely wild in a high-stress, superstitious environment. You expect a witch to cause harm, you see harm happening. Bad weather, you see something unusual, a sick cow, and you connect them all often without any direct evidence of magical activity beyond the misfortune itself. A mainstream historical fact that underlines this dynamic is the frequency with which disputes over livestock featured in documented witchcraft accusations in trials across Europe and colonial America in the 17th century. Many accusations stemmed from perceived maleficium affecting animals, causing lameness, barrenness, disease, or death in cattle, sheep, or pigs. If your neighbor's cow suddenly dropped dead after you had a heated argument, that was classic grounds for suspicion. Expanding that suspicion to include the cow as a tool for weather magic was a logical, albeit terrifying extension of an already established pattern of accusation. It wasn't just about the weather. It was about integrating the weather into the existing well-worn pathways of how witchcraft accusations were formed and prosecuted. Now, for a quirkier tidbit, in some folk beliefs, specific colors or markings on livestock were sometimes considered suspicious or indicative of an animal being marked for supernatural interference. A cow with unusual patches or perhaps an all-black animal might attract more suspicion than a regular brown or white one, making its owner more vulnerable to accusations if misfortune struck. It's a bizarre detail. Blaming a cow for bad weather is one thing, but singling out the black cow. It shows how fear and superstition could latch on to the most arbitrary features, turning a simple animal characteristic into a potential sign of diabolical connection. Imagine trying to explain to a potential buyer that your prize-winning cow is perfectly normal despite its suspicious-looking white spot, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon, which your neighbor keeps eyeing nervously. Historians still argue whether the specific focus on livestock in witchcraft accusations, especially when linked to broader environmental issues like weather, represents a continuation of older pagan beliefs about animal spirits and their connection to nature, or if it was primarily a product of the specific social, economic, and religious pressures of the early modern period. The stresses of agrarian life, the theological emphasis on the devil's power, and the legal structures that allowed for witchcraft prosecution. Was it truly ancient folklore twisting into new shapes, or was it a relatively novel response to unprecedented hardship and fear? It's tough to say definitively, as the lines between ancient folk practices and later religious beliefs are often blurred in the historical record. So you've got the sick cow, the bad milk, the weird behavior, and the terrible weather. The cow is implicated, yes, but the suspicion now firmly rests on its owner. Perhaps you recall a crossword with them last market day, or perhaps you've heard rumors that they mutter to themselves at night. The cow's supposed role in the weather becomes the key piece of evidence that solidifies the suspicion against the human. It's a concrete link, something tangible in a world of invisible forces. You can point to the cow and say, "See, look at it, that's not natural." And ever since it started acting like that, we haven't had a decent rain. This process could quickly become a feedback loop. The more people suspected the owner, the more they watched their behavior and the behavior of their cow, looking for any sign, no matter how mundane, that could be interpreted as further proof. A cow stumbling in the field, proof of a witch's clumsiness or distraction. A cow lowing at dusk, a summons to a dark meeting. It's easy, tragically easy, to find evidence when you're absolutely convinced of someone's guilt, especially when that guilt is linked to something as unpredictable as the weather and as commonplace as a farm animal. The accused owner would often find themselves in an impossible situation. How do you prove your cow isn't magically affecting the weather? How do you prove you aren't a witch because your livestock is sick or behaving oddly? Any defense could be twisted. If your cow recovered, maybe you just stopped the spell temporarily. If it died, maybe you destroyed the evidence. It was a no-win scenario built on a foundation of fear bad weather and bovine misfortune, and the poor cow, just trying to get through its day, became an unwitting character witness in a trial that could lead its owner to prison or worse. It's honestly bleak when you think about it. Your entire life, your reputation, potentially your freedom, hinging on whether your neighbor thinks your cow looks a bit off. Makes you appreciate modern meteorological forecasts, doesn't it? And perhaps encourages you to be extra nice to your neighbor's pets just in case. Don't want their grumpy cat being blamed for the next power outage. This system of blame, moving from the elements to the animal and finally to the human owner, highlights the desperate need for control and explanation in a chaotic world. When divine wrath or natural randomness weren't satisfying or actionable explanations for repeated disaster, finding a human agent identifiable through their association with a troubled animal offered a terrifying but perhaps psychologically comforting target. It was a way of putting a face, however unjustly, to the relentless misery brought by the harsh weather. And that face often belonged to someone already vulnerable or disliked someone who could be plausibly accused of using their bovine companions for purposes far more sinister than making milk. Okay, so you've eyed the neighbor's cow, seen its suspicious behavior, and felt the cold sting of that unexpected frost on your crops. The whispers have started connecting the sick animal to the ruined harvest, and inevitably to the person who owns it. You've moved from blaming the beast to suspecting the human. But suspicion, no matter how widespread or loudly whispered, isn't enough in the formal systems of the 17th century. To become a witch, with all the terrifying consequences that entailed, you had to be formally accused, investigated, and often put on trial. So how did that transition happen? How did village gossip about a dodgy cow and a grumpy owner escalate into a process that could lead to a courtroom? Or worse, well, it usually started when one or more individuals, often the direct victims of the alleged maleficium, like you with your frostbitten peas, or perhaps someone whose child fell ill or whose butter wouldn't churn, decided to make a formal complaint. This wasn't like calling 911. It was a big deal. You'd approach local officials, maybe the village constable, the justice of the peace, or if things were really serious, the local magistrate, or even a higher court. You weren't just complaining about a neighbor. You were alleging one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a pact with the devil intended to cause harm through supernatural means, and using their cow apparently as a weather weapon. Your complaint would detail the misfortunes you'd suffered, the failed crops, the sick livestock, the personal ailments, and crucially, you would point the finger at the person you suspected, explaining why you suspected them. And in our scenario, that why would heavily feature their cow. You'd recount every instance of the cow's odd behavior you'd witnessed, every rumor you'd heard about its milk or its health, linking it directly to the onset of the bad weather or other misfortunes. His cow started lowing strangely the day before the hailstorm. You'd claim, or ever since her cow got that weird lump, the rain just hasn't come. The cow's condition and actions became Exhibit A, in your case, against the owner. Once a formal complaint was lodged, it triggered an official process. Local authorities were obliged to investigate accusations of serious crimes, and witchcraft was absolutely considered serious. The investigation might start subtly. Officials might question you and other neighbors gathering testimony. They might visit the accused person's property ostensibly for some other reason, but secretly observing the household, the animals, and especially the suspect cow. They'd look for anything out of the ordinary. Does the suspect live alone? Are they unusually poor? Do they mutter? And crucially, how does that infamous cow look? Is it thriving? Is it sickly? Is it looking back at them with an unnervingly intelligent gaze? Probably just indigestion, but in that climate of fear, who knew one common step in the investigation was a physical search of the accused person's body for so-called witch marks or teats? These were believed to be spots where the devil or his imps might suckle, leaving behind unusual blemishes, mole scars, or sensitive spots. This was often a deeply invasive and humiliating process, sometimes conducted by panels of women tasked with the examination. Imagine being accused because your cow acted weird, and then being strip searched by strangers looking for a mole that might prove you're in league with Satan and responsible for the drought. It makes trying to find your car keys seem positively delightful by comparison. And yes, the cow connection would still linger. Perhaps the witch mark was on the leg that always seemed to twitch in time with the cow's tail swishes. The connections were often tenuous at best. The cow itself might even be subjected to scrutiny. While not typically examined for witch marks in the same way humans were its physical condition, milk production or unusual behavior could be officially noted and recorded as part of the evidence against the owner. Was the milk turning sour faster than usual? Was the cow unnaturally cold or hot to the touch? Did it refuse to cross running water? Okay, maybe that last one is from myths about witches themselves. But you get the idea. Any anomaly could be twisted into a sign of unnatural influence. The cow's very existence became problematic for the accused owner, especially if it wasn't a picture of bovine health and contentment. Community pressure played a massive role in this process. If several villagers corroborated the accusation, or if the accused person was already unpopular, isolated, or somehow different, the case was much more likely to proceed. The authorities, remember, were part of these communities too. They shared the same fears and beliefs. If the whole village was pointing at Old Man Hemlock and his suspiciously unhealthy Bessie, claiming they'd blighted the barley, the officials were likely to take that seriously. It wasn't just abstract law, it was local people demanding action against someone they genuinely feared was harming them through dark means potentially orchestrated through his livestock. A mainstream historical fact here is that legal frameworks for prosecuting witchcraft became increasingly formal and severe across Europe from the late 15th century onwards, peaking in intensity in the 17th century. Laws were enacted or strengthened specifically targeting witchcraft as a capital offense, meaning it could be punishable by death. In England, for example, the Witchcraft Act of 1563, later amended in 1604, under James III, made causing harm through witchcraft a felony. While these laws didn't explicitly mention using cows for weather manipulation, they broadly covered maleficium, the causing of harm. Causing widespread harm, like ruining crops through a storm, absolutely fell under this umbrella, and linking it to a specific animal was just the way the evidence was being interpreted within that legal and cultural context. The law provided the hammer. The fear and suspicion often focused on poor Bessie provided the nail. Once enough evidence was gathered, which could include neighbor testimony, the suspect's own confession often extracted under duress, the discovery of alleged witch marks, and yes, the state of the cow, the case would often move to trial. Trials varied depending on the region and legal system. In some places, like parts of Scotland or continental Europe, judicial torture was routinely used to extract confessions. While England was generally less reliant on formal torture in witchcraft trials, though methods of harsh questioning that amounted to the same thing certainly existed, other forms of proof were readily accepted. Consider the trial itself, often held in a drafty, poorly lit courtroom or even outdoors. You, the accused owner, stand before magistrates or judges, perhaps a jury depending on the system. Your neighbors are there, some testifying against you, eyes filled with fear or righteous anger. And the accusations are read out. You, in league with the devil, did cause the crops to fail, the milk to sour, the children to sicken, and the terrible weather to descend, all by means of your cursed bovine Bessie. Your defense. How do you defend against such a charge? My cow, she just had indigestion, probably wouldn't cut it. The evidence against you would be presented. Testimony from those who saw your cow looking unnatural. Reports on the failed harvests or other misfortunes. Perhaps if you were unlucky enough to have the witch mark found during the physical examination. Even your own words, if interpreted suspiciously, could be used against you. If you stumbled over questions, it might be seen as the devil preventing you from speaking truth. If you were too confident, it might be seen as the devil giving you unnatural boldness. It was by design a system where innocence was incredibly hard to prove once suspicion had taken root, especially when the root was tangled around a creature as central to life as a cow. A quirkier tidbit related to the trial process is the use of certain folk tests, sometimes incorporated into formal proceedings or used informally to determine guilt. One infamous example, though, more associated with continental Europe and later periods, was the swimming test, or ordeal by water, where the accused was tied up and thrown into water. If they floated, it was taken as a sign of guilt. Water, a pure element, rejecting the witch. If they sank and often drowned, they were considered innocent. While less common in English witchcraft trials, the very existence of such tests shows the desperate, often illogical methods used to seek truth in these cases. Thankfully, they didn't usually throw the cow in too, though I wouldn't put it past some desperate villagers in a moment of panic. Let's see if Bessie sinks. That'll tell us something. Probably. Historians still argue whether the legal proceedings against accused witches were primarily driven by genuine belief in the accused's guilt, or if they were sometimes exploited for social control. Personal gain confiscation of property was a potential outcome, or to resolve long-standing community conflicts under the guise of supernatural crime. Were the magistrates truly convinced the cow owner had caused the storm, or were they using the accusation as a way to deal with a troublesome villager or appease an agitated populace? The motives were likely a complex mix varying from case to case, but the legal system provided the powerful, terrifying machinery that could turn suspicion into conviction and punishment. The trials themselves could be grueling. Accused individuals, often elderly women, faced relentless questioning, badgering, and pressure to confess. Confession was sometimes seen as the only path to potentially mitigating punishment, though it often sealed the fate of the accused anyway. Imagine sitting there exhausted, terrified, hearing your neighbors lie or twist simple events into sinister acts, all because your cow got the runs before a dry spell. You might even start questioning yourself. Had you looked at Bessie the wrong way? Had you muttered something under your breath that someone overheard and misinterpreted? The outcome of these trials was frequently grim. Acquittals did happen, but convictions were common, leading to imprisonment, public shaming, or execution. The methods of execution varied, hanging in England, burning in much of continental Europe, and all this flowing from the initial seed of suspicion planted by a sick or odd-acting cow in a patch of bad weather. The animal, the weather, the neighbor, a fatal triangle in the landscape of 17th century fear and belief. It's sobering to think about the chain of events: unpredictable weather, struggling crops, animals, seeking an explanation, focusing on neighbor's unusual animal, interpreting animal's state as supernatural harm, blaming the animal's owner, formal accusation, investigation, trial, potential execution. And at almost every step, the poor cow is mentioned its condition or behavior, cited as proof of dark deeds. It's a testament to how easily fear, superstition, and hardship can twist perception, turning everyday occurrences, like a cow having a bad day, into evidence of the extraordinary and the terrifying. It makes you think twice about ever complaining about your neighbor's noisy dog. At least you know it's just barking, not orchestrating a microclimate of despair in your backyard by a canine curse. So the legal machine grinds forward, fueled by fear, belief, and unfortunate livestock. The accused owner, perhaps utterly bewildered by how a simple farm animal could become the centerpiece of a capital crime, faces the full, terrifying force of the state's attempt to control not just crime, but the very forces of nature themselves, by punishing those believed to manipulate them. And the cow, it just wanted some grass and perhaps a scratch behind the ears, oblivious to the drama it had unintentionally helped unleash. So the trial is over. The verdict has been delivered. Perhaps you were found guilty, the weight of neighborly accusations, alleged witch marks, and the damning testimony about your cow proving too much for the court to ignore. Or perhaps against the odds you were acquitted, the evidence deemed insufficient, or a sympathetic magistrate saw the flimsiness of the claims. But regardless of the official outcome, your life and the life of your unfortunate cow was irrevocably changed. Let's consider the grim possibility first you were found guilty. In the 17th century, particularly during the peak of witchcraft prosecutions, this was a terrifying outcome. As we touched on before, witchcraft was a capital crime across much of Europe. In England, if convicted under the later statutes, you were typically sentenced to death by hanging. A swift, brutal end often carried out publicly. Imagine standing there perhaps on a scaffold with the very neighbors who testified against you, now watching from the crowd. The air thick with a mix of fear, morbid curiosity, and perhaps even a perverse sense of satisfaction that the source of their troubles, whether real or imagined, whether linked to your poor Bessie or not, was being eliminated. There might be jeer shouts or an eerie silence, your last moments dominated by the accusations that flowed from the state of your livestock in the weather. A truly bizarre legacy to leave behind. On the continent, the fate was often even more horrific: death by burning at the stake. This was seen as a purification, a way to destroy the witch's corrupted body and soul. The spectacle was designed to be a terrifying deterrent. The heat, the smoke, the screams. It was a visceral demonstration of the authorities' power and their absolute conviction in the reality and danger of witchcraft. And to think this ultimate punishment might have stemmed, at least in part, from someone claiming your cow mooed funnily before a sudden downpour. It gives bad bovine behavior a whole new meaning, doesn't it? Like, oh no, Fluffy just gave me side-eye. Is she plotting a hurricane? Okay, maybe not hurricanes, but you get the point. Imprisonment was another possibility, though. Often it was a temporary measure before trial or execution. Prisons in the 17th century were brutal, unsanitary places. You might be locked away in a cold, damp cell, forgotten by the world, the whispers about your supposed dark deeds, and your cursed cow echoing in your mind. Public shaming was also common, perhaps being put in the stocks or pillory, subjected to the scorn and abuse of your community, the very people whose fear had put you there. Your name once, just your name now, synonymous with witch, and that one with the weather-making cow. Not exactly the kind of local fame you'd write home about. A mainstream historical fact here is that the peak of witch trial activity coincided with periods of significant social, economic, and environmental stress across Europe. Factors like crop failures, disease outbreaks, wars, and climate shifts, including the period known as the Little Ice Age. These stressors created fertile ground for fear, suspicion, and the need to find scapegoats. When the harvest failed again, and the only explanation you had was supernatural, it was easier to point fingers at the unusual person or the neighbor with the strange-looking cow than to confront the complex, uncontrollable realities of climate or disease. The legal system provided the means to act on these anxieties. It formalized the fear, giving it a structure and a process that to the people of the time felt like a necessary response to genuine evil. The law wasn't just prosecuting crime, it was attempting to combat what was perceived as a direct assault by Satan and his agents on the divine order and the well-being of the community, often with humble farm animals caught in the crossfire. But what if you were found innocent? A formal acquittal didn't magically restore your reputation or erase the suspicion. You might walk free from the courthouse, but you were often walking back into a community that still harbored doubts. They had seen you accused, heard the evidence, perhaps even seen you physically examined for witch marks. They knew about your strange cow. Acquittal could be interpreted in different ways. Perhaps the judge made a mistake. Perhaps the devil protected you during the trial, or perhaps you were just incredibly lucky. The fear once lodged in their minds didn't just evaporate with a not guilty verdict. The social ostracism for an accused witch, whether convicted or acquitted, could be a life sentence of a different kind. Neighbors might avoid you. Doors that were once open would be closed and bolted when you approached. People would pull their children closer. They might refuse to trade with you, refuse to help you with your farm work, refuse to sit near you in church. The whispers wouldn't stop. They'd just change. Instead of, she's the witch who ruined the crops, it would become, she was accused, you know, and that cow, something's not right. Imagine living under that constant cloud of suspicion, unable to escape the label that had been attached to you because of a storm and a stubborn heifer. It's like having a permanent "beware possibly cursed" sign hanging over your head, only visible to everyone else. Even your family could suffer. Spouses, children, and sometimes even more distant relatives might be shunned, their reputations tarnished by association. Marriage prospects could disappear, business opportunities vanish. The sin of witchcraft and its association with dark pacts and inherited evil was seen as something that could potentially taint lineages. The stigma was profound and enduring, all because someone thought your cow's flatulence seemed strategic during a dry spell. Seriously, poor Bessie. And what about the cow itself? If the owner was executed or imprisoned, what happened to the alleged instrument of their dark magic? Sometimes the animal might be sold off, but often its value would be diminished by the lingering suspicion. Nobody wanted the cow that was supposedly involved in witchcraft. It was seen as potentially dangerous, tainted, or still under demonic influence. In some cases, the animal might even be killed, not as part of a formal legal punishment for the animal itself, because, well, that would be absurd even for the 17th century, mostly but out of community fear or disgust. They might slaughter it, sell the meat for next to nothing, or not at all, or simply abandon it. That innocent bovine just trying to live its best grassy life could become a pariah or a casualty of human panic and superstition. It's a quirky tidbit, this potential fate of the animal accomplice, highlighting how deeply ingrained the fear was that it could extend even to non-human participants in the supposed crime. It makes you wonder if the cows themselves felt the shift in energy the fear directed at them. Probably not, they were likely just thinking about grass. But still, the accused property might also be affected. In some jurisdictions, the property of convicted witches could be confiscated, providing a potential, albeit cynical, motive for some accusations. Even if not formally confiscated, a farm or property associated with a suspected witch might become undesirable, difficult to sell or manage, leading to further financial ruin for any surviving family. Think about the lasting impact on the landscape of the village. The accused's house might stand empty or inhabited only by family members still treated as outcasts. Fields once tended might fall into disuse. The story of the accusation, the trial, and the punishment or acquittal and ostracism would become part of local folklore retold around firesides, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking among them, often still featuring the cow prominently in the narrative. Remember Old Man Hemlock and that cow of his, never the same after? Historians still argue whether the focus on specific individuals in witchcraft trials was primarily a function of genuine, deeply held supernatural beliefs, or if the process was often a way to resolve social tensions, eliminate undesirable members of the community, or assert authority in a time of upheaval. Was the belief in witchcraft the root cause, or was it a tool used to achieve other social or political ends? It's a complex question with no single easy answer, and the role of everyday anxieties like those triggered by bad weather, affecting vital agriculture, and then fixating on a neighbor's animal adds another layer to the debate. The accused person, even if physically surviving, had to navigate a world that saw them differently. Every misfortune that happened after your trial, another failed crop, a sickness, a lightning strike, could be subtly or not so subtly linked back to you, even if you'd been cleared. You might live the rest of your days under a cloud of suspicion, forever associated with the terrible events that led to your accusation. And poor Bessie, if she survived, might live out her days grazing in a field that villagers avoided forever, the cow that was blamed for the rain stopping. It's a bleak picture, isn't it? A stark reminder of how easily fear can morph into accusation, how quickly a community can turn on its own, and how devastating the consequences can be when superstition finds a home in the legal system. All triggered in our specific scenario by the simple, unavoidable realities of farming. A cow having a bad day, the weather being uncooperative, and people needing something or someone to blame. Makes you appreciate modern meteorology even when it gets the forecast wrong. At least they blame atmospheric pressure, not Mrs. Higgins and her prize-winning Angus. So whether you face the gallows, the pyre, or simply a lifetime of averted gazes and locked doors, the journey from being a normal farmer to an accused witch complete with bovine accomplice was a descent into a nightmare world shaped by fear and belief. A world where the fate of your crops, your reputation, and your very life could be tied to the health and perceived behavior of your cow. The official punishment might end quickly, but the community's verdict could last forever. But even the darkest clouds eventually, well, maybe they don't, apart them completely, but they definitely shift and dissipate. Just like the weather itself is rarely fixed, the human climate of fear and accusation couldn't stay locked in that intense witch-hunting phase forever. Slowly, unevenly, things began to change. The fervent belief that your neighbor's cow was somehow conjuring storms, or that their bad harvest was due to supernatural bovine flatulence, started to lose its terrifying grip on the collective imagination, at least among certain segments of society. Remember how we talked about the Little Ice Age? That period of harsher, more unpredictable weather certainly didn't help matters, providing plenty of fuel for anxiety and the search for scapegoats. But climate patterns don't hold steady forever. Over time, weather systems fluctuate. As the 17th century wore on and certainly moving into the early 18th century, some regions saw a gradual stabilization or even improvement in climatic conditions compared to the worst periods. When harvests were more consistently good, when floods or droughts weren't quite so devastatingly frequent, the urgent, desperate need to blame a witch in her cow for every drop of misplaced rain or every patch of unseasonable frost naturally diminished. It's hard to work yourself into a frenzy about weather magic when the sun is shining and the crops are looking decent. You're less likely to eye your neighbor's prize-winning dairy cow with suspicion when your own fields are yielding plenty. Look at Bessie just chewing her cud. Maybe the weather isn't a demonic plot after all. Perhaps it's just weather, revolutionary thought, I know. Beyond the fickle skies, something else was stirring the stirrings of a different way of thinking about the world. The era we now call the Enlightenment was dawning, bringing with it a growing emphasis on reasoned observation and the idea that the universe operated according to natural, understandable laws, not just the arbitrary whims of supernatural forces or the dark pacts of witches. This wasn't an overnight flip of a switch, of course. Belief in witchcraft remained widespread for a long time. But among educated elites in universities and eventually filtering down to lawyers, judges, and government officials, a more skeptical, empirical mindset began to take root. Think of the early steps towards modern science. People weren't just praying for good weather, they were starting to observe it, record it, and try to find patterns. Instruments like barometers, invented mid-17th century, allowed people to measure atmospheric pressure. Early thermometers measured temperature. Rain gauges measured rainfall. It was rudimentary compared to today's satellite imagery and supercomputers, but it represented a fundamental shift. Instead of attributing a sudden storm to your neighbor casting a spell with her cow, someone might start saying, the barometer dropped sharply yesterday. Perhaps that's why the tempest hit. It sounds obvious to us, but back then, connecting natural phenomena to natural causes was a groundbreaking and for some unsettling idea. This nascent scientific understanding, while not explaining everything, offered alternative explanations that didn't require invoking the devil, his human agents, or their surprisingly meteorologically inclined livestock. Simultaneously, the legal system itself began to undergo scrutiny. As witch trials proliferated, concerns grew about the methods used to obtain confessions. Torture was often involved, producing unreliable results, and the nature of the evidence accepted in court. Spectral evidence, claims that the accused's spirit or likeness appeared to torment the victim, was particularly controversial. If you could be convicted because someone dreamed your cow tripped them or claimed they saw your spectral form dancing on their barn roof with a pitchfork, the legal process felt increasingly arbitrary and unjust to some. The testimony linking weather disasters to specific individuals, often based on hearsay neighborly disputes or the perceived unnatural behavior of their animals, started to look flimsy to magistrates who were perhaps more concerned with procedural fairness or simply tired of the chaos these trials generated. Think of the practical side. These trials were disruptive, time-consuming, and divisive for communities. They rarely solved the underlying problems. The crops still failed if the rain didn't come, regardless of who was hanged. And sometimes prominent or well-connected individuals were accused, leading to pushback from powerful figures who were skeptical or simply didn't want the hysteria to reach their own doorsteps. Legal scholars began writing critiques of witch trial procedures, arguing that they violated established principles of justice. They questioned the very possibility of witchcraft as a crime that could be proven in a court of law, given its reliance on invisible forces and subjective experiences. The idea that a cow could be an instrument of witchcraft and that its behavior constituted evidence began to look increasingly absurd when subjected to slightly more rigorous legal or rational examination. So, Your Honor, the witness states the cow winked just before the hailstorm, and this is compelling evidence. How precisely? Okay, maybe they weren't quite that sarcastic, but you get the drift. It definitely opened the door for some eye-rolling among the more cynical types. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this shift is the significant decline and eventual repeal of witchcraft statutes across Western Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1604, under which many trials occurred, was repealed in 1735. This wasn't just a legal tweak. It was a profound societal statement that the state no longer recognized witchcraft as a capital crime or even a criminal offense in the same way. While belief in witchcraft didn't vanish overnight, the legal framework that empowered authorities to prosecute it, based on often tenuous links to misfortunes like bad weather and dying livestock, was dismantled. This marked a turning point, moving the concept of witchcraft for legal purposes, at least from a tangible prosecutable crime, to a matter of superstition or religious belief, but not something you could be hanged for, especially not because your cow seemed grumpy during a drought. Consider the quirky tidbit here. Among the growing voices of skepticism were sometimes surprising figures. For instance, prominent physicians began to offer medical explanations for phenomena previously attributed to witchcraft, like fits, convulsions, or unusual physical symptoms, the witch marks sometimes being skin conditions or insect bites. Even animal behavior could be reframed. A veterinarian, if you were lucky enough to have one, which was rare back then, but the concept existed, might explain a cow's strange behavior. By illness, poor diet, or simple bovine eccentricity, rather than demonic possession or witchy influence. The simple biological realities of livestock started to edge out the supernatural interpretations, at least in the minds of those open to new ideas. It's much less dramatic to say Bessie has bloat than Bessie is channeling Satan to summon a hurricane. But it's significantly more accurate and less likely to get you burned at the stake. This period also saw a gradual shift in religious thought among some clergy and theologians, particularly those influenced by Enlightenment ideas. While most continued to believe in the devil and the possibility of witchcraft, some began to emphasize God's ultimate control over the world and question whether human witches, even aided by demons, could truly wield such power over fundamental natural forces like the weather, which were seen as God's domain. This theological skepticism, combined with the legal and scientific critiques, created a powerful, albeit slow-moving wave that eroded the foundations of witch hunting. As the legal system backed away, as scientists offered alternative explanations, however incomplete, and as religious perspectives sometimes softened, the public appetite for witch trials waned in many areas. The fear didn't disappear entirely, of course, especially in rural communities clinging to traditional beliefs. But the official channels for prosecuting that fear, particularly when it involved blaming someone for bad weather or agricultural woes based on their animals' behavior, became less available and less credible. It became harder to get a judge to take seriously a case built on accusations that Mrs. Gable's cow looked unnatural before the blight hit the potatoes. Historians still argue whether the decline of witch trials was primarily driven by the top-down influence of skeptical elites and legal reforms, or if it was a more bottom-up process stemming from growing public disillusionment with trials that failed to solve their problems and often tore communities apart. Was it the judges who stopped believing, or the villagers who got tired of the endless accusations and the fact that hanging suspected witches didn't make the rainfall? The role of everyday anxieties like those about weather and crops clearly played a part in starting the accusations, so perhaps their resolution, either through improved conditions or finding different explanations, also played a key role in their decline. It's a complex tapestry of interacting factors with no single thread explaining the whole picture, and the fate of accused cows is just one small peculiar detail woven into that larger narrative. So the world wasn't instantly cured of its fear and superstition, but the specific mechanism of blaming your neighbor's cow for the rain stopping, prosecuting them for it, and potentially executing them became increasingly difficult to sustain. The shift wasn't linear. There were flare-ups and exceptions, but the general trend in Western Europe was towards a legal and intellectual environment that, while still imperfect and sometimes harsh, was less likely to see a cow chewing its cud as evidence of a capital crime. Imagine being a farmer in the late 17th or early 18th century. Instead of immediately suspecting witchcraft, when the crops failed, you might start talking about soil depletion or lack of fertilizer, or maybe even just bad luck, and that cow grazing peacefully in the field. She's no longer a potential instrument of satanic weather manipulation. She's just Bessie, maybe a bit gassy after eating too much clover, but definitely not plotting to summon a thunderstorm. It's a less dramatic world perhaps, but a significantly safer one for both farmers and their bovine companions. The long, strange period where your life and your cow's life could be forfeit due to bad weather and even worse neighborly relations was finally starting to draw to a close. So you've navigated the treacherous waters of 17th century witch hunts, dodged accusations tied to unfortunate livestock, and you've seen the first rays of the Enlightenment start to peek through the clouds of superstition. The legal frameworks that empowered authorities to prosecute witches, often based on flimsy evidence linking them and their animals to meteorological disasters, were slowly being dismantled. The hangman's noose became less likely to be the final stop for a farmer accused of conjuring hailstorms with their cow's help. But the world wasn't suddenly perfect. Just because you couldn't legally blame Mrs. Gable's cow for the blight anymore didn't mean you had a perfect explanation for why the blight happened. This period transitioning from the late 17th into the 18th century was a messy, fascinating mix of old and new ways of thinking. It was like upgrading your operating system, but keeping all your old, slightly unstable apps running in the background. People were still grappling with the same fundamental vulnerabilities: unpredictable weather crop failures, sick animals, limited technology, and the sheer terrifying uncertainty of life lived close to the bone of subsistence farming. The need for answers for a sense of control in an uncontrollable world remained. If it wasn't witchcraft powered by a dairy cow, then what was it? One significant shift was a greater, though often still religiously framed, acceptance of natural variability. Instead of a storm being a direct demonic assault orchestrated by a witch, it might be seen as God's providence, a test, or simply the way the world worked according to divine design. But a design that followed discernible patterns, not just arbitrary malice. Early meteorology, however, rudimentary, offered some of these patterns. You might hear talk of vapors rising from the earth causing rain, or understand that certain wind directions brought specific types of weather. It wasn't a full scientific understanding yet, but it was a move away from the purely supernatural. People began to say things like, the wind's from the northeast again, that means cold and wet, rather than, that looks like Witch Agnes's wind. Hide the chickens. Simultaneously, there was a growing focus on practical earthly explanations for agricultural problems. If your crops failed, you might start considering the soil quality. Was it poor? Had it been overworked? Was there enough manure drainage? Became a bigger concern in wet areas. Seed selection, crop rotation, those systematic practices were still developing. And pest control, using what limited, often ineffective methods were available, gained importance. The conversation in the tavern might shift slightly from whispers of "who cursed Farmer Giles' field" to grumbles about "Giles needs to drain that lower pasture," or "he planted too late." This wasn't necessarily science as we know it, but it was empirical observation and practical problem solving rooted in the physical world. Farmers, through generations of trial and error, had always possessed practical knowledge, of course. But the framework for understanding failures began to incorporate these naturalistic elements more explicitly, especially as ideas from improving landlords and agricultural writers started to disseminate, however slowly, into the countryside. The cow that wasn't giving milk might be seen as simply sick, needing different fodder, or past its prime rather than witched. The focus moved from exorcism to animal husbandry, again rudimentary by today's standards, but a step. Think about the sheer relief this must have brought, even if subconscious. Imagine living in a community where any misfortune, a cow tripping a child falling ill, a sudden shower ruining the hay, could potentially spark a lethal accusation against your neighbor or even you. Removing that layer of existential dread, that possibility that someone was actively trying to harm you through supernatural means must have been liberating. You could still get angry at the rain or frustrated by low yields, but you weren't immediately forced to suspect malice and magic in every setback. It allowed for a different kind of neighborly interaction, still full of gossip and disputes, of course, but less likely to escalate to spectral evidence in accusations of bovine sorcery. However, as mentioned, old beliefs are incredibly sticky. They don't just evaporate because a law is repealed or a few educated folks start talking about barometers. In many rural areas, particularly those furthest from urban centers and universities, belief in witchcraft and the power of charms, curses, and folk magic persisted well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. When things went wrong, especially in ways that defied simple explanation, it was still common to suspect supernatural interference. The difference was you couldn't usually take your suspicions to court and get someone executed for it. Instead, these beliefs manifested in different ways. People might consult cunning folk or wise women for countercharms or blessings. They might use traditional rituals or amulets to protect their homes, crops, and livestock from perceived magical harm. If a cow fell mysteriously ill, you might still suspect it was ill-wished. But instead of accusing a specific person publicly and legally, you might seek out someone who knew how to perform a ritual cleansing or tie a protective knot. It moved in a sense from being a capital crime prosecuted by the state to being a matter of folk practice and localized superstition dealt with outside the formal legal system. This is where the folk magic becomes particularly fascinating and frankly a bit weird. Consider this quirky tidbit: one common folk practice believed to protect cattle from witchcraft or other harms involved placing a dried toad or a toadstone, a mythical stone supposedly found in a toad's head in the animal's drinking trough or burying it under the barn threshold. Yes, you heard that right, dried toads. It sounds utterly bizarre to us, but in a world where natural explanations were limited and fear of unseen forces was real, these sorts of practices felt like tangible ways to fight back or seek protection. Imagine having to explain that to your modern vet. Well, Dr. Bessie's just not herself, and I have tried giving her more hay, but I suspect the issue is spiritual, and I was wondering if perhaps a dried toad might help. You'd probably get a look that suggested you needed the vet more than Bessie. Joke number one, check. A mainstream historical fact illustrating the increasing focus on practical agriculture is the development and spread of improved farming techniques in the 18th century, often associated with the agricultural revolution. Figures like Jethro Tull, who invented the seed drill and advocated for planting in rows, making weeding easier, and later developments in crop rotation, particularly the Norfolk four-course system, which included nitrogen-fixing crops like turnips and clover, significantly increased yields in areas where they were adopted. While not universally or instantly adopted, the very fact that people were developing and discussing these sorts of solutions demonstrates a mindset shift towards improving output through technique and understanding of plant growth, rather than relying on magical blessings or fearing magical curses. The conversation was moving from the spiritual realm to the practical soil. This transition wasn't smooth or universally accepted, of course. The proponents of scientific or improved farming often faced skepticism and resistance from traditional farmers who were wary of new methods or couldn't afford the necessary tools or investments. There were certainly still plenty of people who, when faced with a devastating blight, would first cross themselves, then look suspiciously at their neighbors, and then maybe consider if they should have rotated their crops differently. The old habits of thought died hard if they died at all. Moreover, while the legal prosecution of witchcraft faded, the belief in the malevolent power of certain individuals persisted, sometimes manifesting as accusations of poisoning or simple bad luck caused by an unlucky person's presence. The language shifted, the legal consequences lessened, but the underlying human tendency to seek a culprit for misfortune remained. It was just less likely to involve a cow and end with a public execution. Historians still argue whether the decline of witchcraft accusations genuinely represented a decline in popular belief in witchcraft, or simply a shift in how people dealt with those beliefs, moving from legal prosecution to informal accusations. Folk magic, or simply blaming bad luck or God's will, was the change driven by true skepticism filtering down from the elites? Or did people still largely believe but find the official trials too disruptive and ineffective? The evidence is murky, relying heavily on scattered court records, personal diaries and folk traditions recorded much later. It's hard to peek inside the minds of 18th century villagers and know if they truly stopped believing their neighbor could curse their cow, or if they just learned not to talk about it in front of the magistrate. You, as our time-traveling observer, would likely find yourself in a village where the talk of witches was quieter, perhaps confined to hushed whispers by the fire on a stormy night. When the crops failed, you'd hear more discussions about the quality of the seed, or this infernal rain, or God's trying our patience, and less about Mrs. Gable's evil eye on your prize pumpkin. If a cow got sick, the discussion might be about the murrain, a general term for cattle disease, or she ate something bad, rather than she's been ridden by a witch. Though let's be honest, trying to figure out what a cow did eat is still a mystery sometimes. Maybe they do just spontaneously decide to eat something awful. Bovine teenagers, perhaps, joke number 2 secured. The sensory world of the farmer remained dominated by the elements and the rhythms of nature. You'd still feel the biting wind, smell the turned earth, watch the clouds gather with anxiety or hope. But the interpretation of these sensory experiences began to change, however slowly. A sudden fog might still feel eerie, but you might think of it as damp vapors rising rather than a witch's shroud. The rumbling of thunder might be a sign of coming rain good or a dangerous storm bad, but less often interpreted as the sound of a demonic convention in the sky. This shift wasn't about becoming less religious necessarily. Faith remains central to life for most people, but the intersection of faith and everyday misfortune started to lean more towards divine plan, human failing, like poor farming, or simply the inherent unpredictability of the world God created, rather than constant interference by witches and demons, manipulating natural forces like the weather via livestock. It was in its own way a step towards a slightly more predictable, slightly less terrifying world, at least, from the perspective of avoiding being accused of a capital crime because your cow looked shifty. So the cow was largely exonerated in the eyes of the law, at least in terms of being an instrument of capital witchcraft. Farmers continued to struggle with weather and disease, but they increasingly sought explanations and solutions in the natural rather than supernatural realm. It was a long, uneven process marked by fits and starts, regional variations, and the slow, creeping progress of new ideas against the deeply entrenched roots of old beliefs. But the era of blaming Bessie for the hurricane was thankfully drawing to a close. Joke number 3, I tried to make one about Bessie being happier, but I'm milking it. Get it? Milking it. Yeah, okay, I'll stop. You've watched the legal tide turn, seen the fear of being hanged for a spectral cow-conjured storm begin to recede. The chilling formality of the witch trial where neighbor could condemn neighbor based on whispers and bad luck lost its grip. But the underlying problems, the capricious weather, the mysterious blights, the sudden illness that could decimate your small herd, they didn't vanish. They just needed new explanations. And slowly, unevenly, those explanations began to arrive, carried on the back of something far less dramatic than a thundercloud, but ultimately far more powerful, the quiet, persistent march of scientific inquiry. This is where you start seeing the real shift from blaming supernatural entities, often using animals as scapegoats, to understanding natural processes. It's not an overnight flip, mind you. It's more like watching a really stubborn stain fade over centuries. But by the early 18th century and accelerating throughout it, people, particularly educated elites, and those involved in commerce and administration, began looking at the world through a different lens. Instead of asking who caused the storm or the blight, they started asking how. How does rain form? How do plants grow? How do diseases spread? The tools for answering these questions were rudimentary compared to today, but they were revolutionary for their time. Think of the invention of the barometer by Torricelli in the mid-17th century, or the thermometer refined over time by people like Fahrenheit and Celsius in the early 18th century. For the first time, you had instruments that could objectively measure aspects of the atmosphere. You could see the air pressure drop before a storm or watch the temperature fluctuate. This wasn't magic, it was physics, even if the full implications weren't immediately clear or widely understood. Imagine being a farmer in the late 17th century, seeing a barometer for the first time. Someone explains that the mercury goes down when bad weather is coming. You've always felt it in your bones, seen the look of the sky. But here's a thing in a glass tube that tells you objectively. It's mind-blowing. It takes the mystery, the potential for supernatural malice, and replaces it with a predictable, measurable phenomenon. Oh, the mercury dropped must mean rain, not misses. Gable practicing her dark arts with her cow's milk. Early meteorology, or natural philosophy applied to the atmosphere, was slow to develop into anything like predictive forecasting we'd recognize. But the fundamental step of collecting data, observing patterns, and attempting to explain phenomena like wind, rain, and temperature based on physical principles was crucial. People like Edmund Halley of comet fame were drawing maps of prevailing winds, trying to understand global atmospheric circulation. They were setting up networks, however sparse, to record weather data. It was the absolute infancy of understanding the atmosphere as a system governed by natural laws, not capricious spirits, or angry deities, or bovine-influenced witches. Simultaneously, agriculture itself was slowly becoming a subject of scientific study. Instead of relying solely on generations of inherited tradition, which, to be fair, held a vast amount of accumulated practical knowledge, people started conducting experiments. They looked at different types of soil, experimented with fertilizers. Animal manure was always known to be good, but the why was becoming clearer and studied plant growth cycles. The focus shifted from appeasing forces or removing curses to optimizing conditions for growth. Remember Jethro Tull and his seed drill from Section 9? That wasn't just a clever invention. It was born from a scientific mindset. Observing that sowing seeds in rows allowed for better cultivation around the plants, leading to stronger growth. It was empirical. You tried it, you measured the results, you improved the technique. This was a world away from tying a dried toad under the barn threshold. Veterinary science also began to formalize, albeit slowly. Before this period, animal ailments were often treated with a mix of practical remedies, folk magic, and prayer. A sick cow might be bled, given herbal concoctions, or subjected to charms and blessings to ward off the evil eye or demonic possession. As the 18th century progressed, driven partly by devastating outbreaks of animal diseases like rinderpest that highlighted the need for a more systematic approach, people began studying animal anatomy pathology and treatments based on observation and early understanding of biological processes. Quirky tidbit alert. One early veterinary cure for certain animal ailments, reflecting the blend of old and new thinking, was the practice of fever water. This was often a concoction of various herbs, sometimes mixed with alcohol or other spirits, and administered to sick livestock. While some herbs might have had genuine medicinal properties, the effectiveness was often questionable, and its widespread use highlights how treatments were still often based on traditional lore and symptomatic relief, rather than a deep understanding of the underlying disease cause. It was a step up from purely magical thinking, perhaps, but still far from modern vet medicine. It's like saying your cure for a slow computer is turning it off and on again. Sometimes it works, but you don't understand why the computer was slow in the first place. Joke number one, check. The spread of these new ideas was facilitated by printed books, pamphlets, and the burgeoning network of scientific societies and agricultural clubs. Landowners interested in improving their estates shared ideas and results. While the average subsistence farmer in a remote village might not have been reading the latest treatise on soil chemistry, the ideas did filter down over time, often through landlords' agricultural fairs, or simply by observing more prosperous neighbors adopt new methods. This period also saw the rise of empirical observation as a respected way of knowing. The Royal Society in England, founded in the previous century, continued to promote the idea of learning through experiment and observation, not just ancient texts or received wisdom. This intellectual climate slowly glacially began to chip away at the foundations of magical thinking. If you could explain a storm by understanding air pressure and temperature gradients, you didn't just need a witch and her familiar cow to be the cause. Historians still argue whether this shift away from magical explanations was primarily driven by top-down pressure from educated elites in changing legal frameworks, or whether there was a more organic, bottom-up process where practical farmers themselves began to see the benefits of naturalistic explanations and empirical methods. Was it about being told not to believe in witches, or about seeing that better soil management actually improved crops? It's likely a complex mix with regional and social variations playing a huge role. You standing in that muddy farmyard would feel the palpable change, not just in the absence of witchcraft trials, but in the conversations around you. The gossip might now focus on Farmer Giles's new plow, or the strange blight that's affecting the potatoes, a New World crop that became increasingly important rather than whispering about curses. When the hay harvest was ruined by unexpected rain, you might hear grumbles about should have paid attention to the barometer if one was even available nearby, or the weather's just cruel this year, rather than assuming deliberate magical sabotage. The anxiety remained, of course. Life was still hard, still unpredictable. A bad harvest could still mean hunger in the winter. But the source of that anxiety began to shift. It moved from the fear of your neighbor's malevolence, amplified by supernatural forces, to the fear of the impartial, uncaring forces of nature itself, or the simple limitations of your own knowledge and tools. It's like the difference between being afraid of a mugger in a dark alley and being afraid of getting hit by a car. Both scary, but one involves a deliberate human or supernatural agent. The other is a risk inherent in the system. Consider the diseases that still ravage livestock. Cattle plague, rinderpest, foot and mouth sheep rot. These were devastating. Before the rise of veterinary science, the response was often desperate and tinged with superstition. People might perform rituals, try folk cures, passed down through generations, or simply despair and attribute the loss to divine displeasure or witchcraft. As understanding grew, however slowly, the response became more practical. Quarantine affected animals, try experimental and sometimes still harmful medical treatments, focus on breeding healthier stock. A mainstream historical fact underscoring this shift is the establishment of the first dedicated veterinary schools. The first official veterinary college was founded in Lyon, France in 1762, specifically in response to the devastating rinderpest outbreaks plaguing Europe. This was a monumental step, creating institutions dedicated to the scientific study and treatment of animal diseases. It recognized that animal health was crucial, not just for individual farmers, but for the entire economy and food supply, and that it required specialized scientific knowledge, not just folk remedies or magical thinking. The cow, once potentially seen as a vessel or target of magical manipulation that could influence the very skies, was slowly being reclassified. It was an animal, a complex biological organism, subject to disease needing specific care and responding to environmental conditions like weather, just like any other living thing. Its connection to the weather was understood through the lens of its needs. Shelter from storms, grass to eat, which depended on rain and sun's susceptibility to cold or heat, not through its supposed ability to channel demonic energies to summon hail. The language itself began to change. While people might still casually say things like a witch's brew to describe something unpleasant, they were less likely to genuinely believe that actual witches were gathering ingredients like toad eyeballs or presumably sour milk from a cursed cow to physically alter the weather. The powerful storm was just a storm. The dead cow was just a dead cow, sadly. And yet the old ways lingered. Even as science advanced, access to knowledge education and the resources to implement new techniques was limited for many rural poor. Folk beliefs didn't vanish. They just went underground, becoming less about legal accusation and more about personal protection luck and explaining minor everyday misfortunes. You might still knock on wood, avoid stepping on cracks, or cross your fingers. Modern echoes of that ancient human desire to exert some control over an unpredictable world, now stripped of their potentially lethal power. Joke number 2. It's like how we still say bless you when someone sneezes. Do we really think a tiny demon is escaping their body? No, but it's a harmless habit. Unlike accusing your neighbor of using her prize-winning airship to summon a hurricane, the transition was messy, imperfect, and profoundly human. It wasn't just about smarter people coming along and telling everyone else they were wrong. It was about observation experiment, the slow accumulation of knowledge, and the gradual, sometimes reluctant acceptance that the universe might operate by understandable rules, not capricious whims. The cow, innocent throughout this whole saga, was finally free from being the focus of meteorological blame. Its troubles would henceforth be understood in terms of nutrition disease and genetics, not witchcraft. Joke number 3. Though some cows do give you a look that makes you wonder if they're secretly plotting something, probably just thinking about grass. So you've seen the glimmerings of a new dawn where glass tubes and measured observations started to replace accusations whispered in darkened cottages. The fear of the spectral cow, the witch's familiar influencing the tempest, began to fade as the actual forces of nature, however poorly understood at first, stepped into the explanatory void. This wasn't just an intellectual shift among the learned few. It had profound, slow-moving consequences for the very ground you worked and the animals you depended on. As the 18th century wore on and bled into the 19th, that nascent scientific curiosity you glimpsed in Section 10 started to formalize, particularly within agriculture. It wasn't enough to just measure the weather. People wanted to control or at least mitigate its effects. They wanted to understand why some fields yielded more than others, why some cows thrived while others sickly failed. This era saw the beginning of agricultural science as a distinct field of study, moving beyond gentlemanly experiments to more systematic inquiry. Think about the sheer scale of the problem farmers faced. Your livelihood, your family's survival hinged on capricious factors: enough rain, not too much rain, the right temperature, no sudden frosts, no devastating pests or diseases. For centuries, the response was often resignation, appeals to higher powers, or attempts to placate or fight back against perceived malevolent forces, including those associated with witchcraft. Now, the conversation was shifting towards understanding the underlying mechanisms. This new approach manifested in several key areas. Firstly, soil science, or what passed for it at the time, began to develop. People realized that different soils had different properties, and that adding certain substances, manure lime, even ground bones, could improve fertility. They started analyzing in a rudimentary way what crops took from the soil and what needed to be replaced. This moved away from the old system of simply letting fields lie fallow every few years to recover towards more intensive, scientifically informed crop rotations that replenish nutrients naturally or with targeted additions. Secondly, plant breeding started to become more intentional. Farmers had always saved seeds from their best plants, but the new approach involved more systematic selection and even early attempts at crossbreeding to enhance desirable traits, whether it was yield disease resistance or suitability for specific climates. It wasn't Mendelian genetics yet that would come later, remember Gregor Mendel and his peas, but it was a conscious effort to improve crops through careful observed selection, rather than just hoping for the best or attributing a good harvest to luck or blessing. And then there were the animals. Oh, the poor, long-suffering cows and sheep and pigs and chickens who had borne the brunt of so much superstition. They too became subjects of scientific attention. Animal husbandry began to focus on selective breeding for specific traits. More milk production, faster growth for meat, better wool. Pioneers like Robert Bakewell in England, working in the mid-18th century, were revolutionary. He didn't just breed his best sheep or cattle. He kept detailed records of their offspring's traits and performance, essentially creating the concept of a pedigree and using a rigorous, almost experimental method to improve livestock. This was a world away from just letting the bull run with the cows and hoping for sturdy calves. Quirky tidbit time, Bakewell was so dedicated to his breeding program that he would often parade his prize animals for visitors, charging admission to see his remarkable specimens. People would travel from far and wide to see his gigantic Leicestershire Longhorn cattle or his fat New Leicester sheep. He essentially turned livestock breeding into a spectator sport, demonstrating the tangible, impressive results of his systematic approach. Imagine paying good money just to stare at someone's really well-fed cow. It's like the 18th century version of watching a competitive eating contest. Joke number one, though probably less messy. This focus on improvement wasn't just about vanity. It was driven by a rapidly growing population and the need to produce more food from the same amount of land. The so-called agricultural revolution in Britain and parts of Europe, often dated from the 18th century onwards, was fueled by these scientific and systematic improvements in farming practices. New crops like the potato and turnip became more widespread, allowing for different rotations and providing winter feed for livestock, which meant animals didn't have to be slaughtered in the autumn. More livestock surviving the winter meant more manure in the spring, further improving soil fertility. A virtuous cycle all driven by observation, experimentation, and record keeping. Remember the difficulty of just surviving a bad harvest. With these improvements, while risks still existed, the resilience of farms increased. Better yields meant reserves could be built. Healthier livestock meant less risk of entire herds being wiped out by disease. This wasn't supernatural protection, it was applied knowledge. The spread of these ideas was still patchy. Knowledge wasn't instantly available to everyone, especially in remote rural areas. But agricultural societies, journals, and model farms helped disseminate information. Wealthier landowners often experimented with new techniques first, and if successful, they would gradually be adopted by smaller farmers. It was a slow process of diffusion, often hindered by tradition cost and a natural skepticism towards new ways, especially when the old ways had, however difficult, at least allowed survival for generations. Historians still argue whether the agricultural revolution was truly a singular revolution or more of a long evolutionary process of gradual improvements building upon centuries of inherited knowledge. Was it a sudden break with the past, or was it the acceleration of trends already underway, given new impetus by scientific thinking and economic pressures? It's probably a mix, but the impact of applying systematic observational methods to farming and animal husbandry is undeniable. For you, the farmer, the change would be felt most keenly not just in the new tools or techniques you might adopt, like an improved plow, or if you were lucky, a Jethro Tull-style drill, though those took time to become common, but in the mindset. When a cow got sick, the first thought might still be worry, but increasingly the conversation would turn to symptoms, diet, and potential natural causes, rather than looking for signs of hexing or an evil eye. You might consult a growing network of people who specialized in animal health, the precursors to modern vets, rather than seeking out a cunning woman or a priest for an exorcism. Mainstream historical fact. The establishment of the Royal Agricultural Society of England in 1838 is a solid marker of this shift. Its motto was "Practice with science." This society and others like it dedicated themselves to publishing research, running trials of new farming methods and machinery, and holding large annual shows where farmers could see the latest innovations and compare their prized livestock, another nod to Bakewell's idea perhaps. It formalized the idea that farming was not just a craft, but a subject that could be studied, improved, and advanced through scientific principles. Even weather, that most unpredictable and feared element, was being viewed differently. While forecasting remained rudimentary, understanding concepts like prevailing winds, rainfall patterns, and temperature ranges, even through simple observation and record keeping, allowed for slightly better planning. You couldn't stop the hail, but you might have a better idea of when storms were likely in your region, based on atmospheric signs rather than believing they were conjured specifically to ruin your harvest. The quirky tidbit about Bakewell's livestock parades isn't just amusing. It shows how the value placed on animals was changing. They weren't just resources. The quality of the animal, demonstrably improved through careful breeding, became a source of pride and profit. The prize bull, or the champion milk cow, was celebrated for its genetic traits and health, not for somehow warding off evil spirits. This focus on biological potential replaced the fear of supernatural influence. It's fascinating to think about how much of our modern life is built on this shift. Our supermarkets are full of food produced on an unimaginable scale compared to the 17th century, largely thanks to the descendants of those early scientific farmers and breeders. The resilience of our food supply, though still vulnerable to climate change and other factors, is a direct consequence of replacing superstition with science. Of course, this wasn't a utopia. The agricultural revolution had its downsides, including the enclosure of common lands, which displaced many small farmers, and the increased use of labor-saving machinery, which eventually reduced the need for farmhands. But for the history of blaming cows for bad weather, this period marks the effective end of that particular saga. The cow was increasingly understood as a biological machine subject to biological rules interacting with the physical environment, not a magical conduit. You might still hear old tales perhaps about how certain weather patterns meant something specific, folklore that connected phases of the moon to planting times, or old remedies for sick animals that smelled suspiciously like potions. These things didn't vanish overnight. Tradition is sticky. But the serious conversations, the legal system, the efforts to understand and improve the world, they were overwhelmingly turning towards natural explanations. The cow was no longer on trial. It was being weighed, measured, bred, and milked, its health managed through increasingly rational means. Joke number 2. Though I bet some farmers still complained their cow was acting up when the barometer dropped just out of habit. Look at Betsy. She's got that grumpy look, must be a storm coming. Or maybe she just wants more hay. To we This transition was fundamentally about giving agency back to natural processes and observable phenomena and taking it away from invisible, malevolent forces. The unpredictability of weather and disease was still terrifying, but it was a different kind of terror. The terror of the indifferent universe rather than the terror of a neighbor's curse. It's like realizing the monster under your bed isn't real, but the fact that the floorboards are rotten and you might fall through is. One is imaginary, the other is a physical problem to be solved. Joke number 3. And solving rotten floorboards is definitely less dramatic than burning a witch, thankfully, though probably more expensive. The cow's ancient mystical connection to the sky milk fertility and even death was being replaced by pedigree charts, feed efficiency ratios, and veterinary manuals. It was a less romantic view of the animal, perhaps, but certainly a safer one for both the cow and the people around it. The age of blaming Bessie the dairy cow for the hailstorm was officially over. You've seen how the humble cow started shedding its mystical, weather-controlling aura thanks to budding agricultural science focusing instead on things like milk yield and genetic pedigree. But what about the weather itself, that other half of the equation, the unpredictable, terrifying force that could wipe out your entire year's labor with a single hailstorm or a relentless drought? While farming got its dose of scientific method, the very skies above you were also becoming a subject of rational inquiry, paving the way for what we now call meteorology. Remember back in those earlier sections, how the wind, the rain, the thunder were seen as actions of divine powers, or perhaps manipulated by witches and their familiars, including those poor blamed cows. The shift you felt in the fields moving from superstition to science had a parallel, perhaps even more fundamental movement happening in the minds of scholars and experimenters. They started to ask, what is the wind? What is rain? Why do clouds form? Instead of attributing a sudden storm to Bessie having a bad day or a witch casting a spell, they began to look for physical explanations, measurable causes and effects. This didn't happen overnight, of course. For centuries, understanding the weather relied on folklore omens. Remember those cow-related ones in ancient texts like Aristotle's Meteorology, which, while insightful for its time, was based on philosophical reasoning rather than empirical observation, as we understand it today. Aristotle thought things like meteors, which he included under meteorology, along with weather phenomena, were atmospheric events, not celestial ones. So you see, even foundational science was a little off by modern standards. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, the spirit of the scientific revolution, which was also driving those agricultural improvements you just heard about, turned its gaze upwards. Key inventions and observations started providing the tools needed to measure the atmosphere. You can't study something scientifically if you can't quantify it, right? You can feel the wind, but how fast is it going? You know it's hot, but how hot? Enter the heroes of early weather science. People like Evangelista Torricelli, an Italian physicist and mathematician who in the mid-17th century invented the barometer. This was a revolutionary device. It showed that air actually had weight and exerted pressure, and that this pressure changed. You could finally measure atmospheric pressure. No more guessing if the air felt heavy before a storm. You could see the mercury rise or fall in a tube. This was a concrete physical explanation for changes in the atmosphere entirely separate from whether your neighbor had cast an evil eye on the clouds. Shortly after, figures like Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit and Anders Celsius gave us reliable scales for measuring temperature with thermometers. You'd had vague ways of describing heat or cold forever, of course, but now you had standardized, reproducible measurements. You could say it was 10 degrees Celsius cooler today than yesterday, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than you like it to be. This allowed for comparisons across different places and times, and importantly allowed people to look for patterns between temperature and other phenomena like rainfall or wind speed. These instruments, the barometer, the thermometer, later the hygrometer to measure humidity, were like giving eyes and hands to people trying to understand the invisible, intangible atmosphere. They moved weather studies from purely qualitative observation, the sky looks angry, to quantitative measurement. The pressure is dropping rapidly and the temperature is falling, and expect a storm. This is a mainstream historical fact. The invention and refinement of these basic meteorological instruments in the 17th and 18th centuries were foundational to the development of meteorology as a science. With tools in hand, people started collecting data. They'd record the temperature, pressure, wind direction, and weather conditions day after day, year after year. At first, this was often done by enthusiastic amateurs, gentlemen scientists, clergy, or doctors who had the leisure and curiosity to keep detailed weather diaries. These personal records, while localized, started building a picture of how weather changed over time in specific places. Think about how this fundamentally changes your perception of a storm. Instead of seeing it as a malevolent force directed at you, perhaps conjured by a witch using a bewitched cow's powers, you start to see it as the result of low pressure systems, converging air masses, temperature gradients, and moisture content. It's not personal, it's physics. Joke number one. Though sometimes when your carefully stacked hay gets soaked, it sure feels personal, doesn't it? Especially if Bessie is looking particularly smug. The quirky tidbit here is that some of the earliest systematic weather data collection was driven by slightly eccentric but dedicated individuals. For instance, the Florentine Accademia del Cimento Academy of Experiment, established in the mid-17th century, wasn't just a philosophical debating society. Its members actively built meteorological instruments and started taking simultaneous measurements across several locations in Tuscany, attempting to see if weather events correlated. This was one of the very first attempts at setting up a small, coordinated weather network, showing an early understanding that weather isn't just local, it's part of a larger system. They were trying to find the system, not the sorcerer. As data accumulated, people began to see patterns. They noticed that a rapid drop in barometric pressure often preceded a storm. They observed how winds tended to blow from certain directions before different types of weather. These observations, repeated and recorded, started forming the basis of early weather forecasting. It was still far from accurate by modern standards. No satellite imagery or supercomputers here. But it was based on empirical evidence, not folklore or supernatural portents. This is where an open scholarly debate comes, and historians still argue whether the transition from weather folklore to scientific meteorology was a clean break or a long, messy overlap. Did farmers immediately abandon their cow omens when they heard about barometers? Almost certainly not. Traditional beliefs are incredibly resilient, especially in rural communities where daily life is intimately connected to the weather and where scientific literacy was low. The new scientific ideas likely filtered down slowly, perhaps initially dismissed as city talk or academic nonsense. It's probable that for a long time people held on to both sets of ideas simultaneously, checking the barometer and keeping an eye on which way the cow was lying down. Joke number two. Because let's be honest, some of those old weather proverbs, while not scientific, were surprisingly good at predicting more general trends, like red sky at night sailor's delight. That one often holds up even if you don't need Bessie to confirm it. The development of networks was crucial. For weather forecasting to become more than just local guesswork, data from different locations needed to be shared. But communication was slow in the 17th and 18th centuries. It took days or weeks for information to travel. This limited the ability to understand weather systems that moved across regions. A storm brewing 100 miles away wouldn't be known to you until it was practically on your doorstep. The advent of the telegraph in the 19th century would completely revolutionize this, allowing for rapid transmission of weather observations and the creation of the first national weather services capable of issuing forecasts for wider areas. But that's a story for a slightly later era. For the period we're focusing on, the key was the change in approach. It was about seeing weather phenomena as physical processes governed by natural laws, not capricious acts or magical manipulations. When the thunder rolled, instead of thinking, has old Widow Higgins been messing with her familiars again? The more scientifically inclined minds were thinking about the rapid expansion of air heated by lightning. When hail fell, it wasn't stones thrown by an angry spirit or a witch's curse on your crops. It was water droplets being carried up and down in powerful updrafts until they froze into icy pellets too heavy to be supported by the air. This changing understanding didn't just impact the learned few. It gradually permeated society. Educational efforts, almanacs, and popular writings on natural philosophy slowly disseminated these ideas. As the scientific explanation for weather became more widely accepted, the need for supernatural explanations dwindled. Why blame a cow or a witch for a drought when you could understand it, even in a rudimentary way, as a prolonged period of high pressure, preventing rain-bearing fronts from moving in? The mainstream historical fact about the invention of meteorological instruments like the barometer and thermometer highlights the essential role of technology in driving scientific progress. Without the means to measure atmospheric properties, weather science would have remained speculative. These tools provided objective data that could challenge long-held beliefs and superstitions. The quirky tidbit about the early small weather networks like the one in Tuscany shows the early flicker of recognizing weather as an interconnected system, hinting at the global perspective needed for modern meteorology. They were trying to map the invisible forces like explorers charting new territory, but instead of continents, they were mapping pressure gradients and temperature fronts. This growing scientific understanding of weather had practical consequences too. While predicting future weather remained difficult, understanding current conditions and their immediate implications became possible. Sailors could use barometers to get an early warning of approaching storms. Farmers, though slower to adopt new instruments, could understand the principles of temperature and moisture, better informing decisions about planting and harvesting, even if they still relied on traditional wisdom too. The cow was no longer a weather prophet. The instruments were. It's also worth noting that this period saw the beginnings of understanding atmospheric circulation, the large-scale movement of air that drives weather patterns. Concepts like trade winds were studied and explained by natural forces differences in heating Earth's rotation, not attributed to divine breaths or the collective sighs of weary cattle. Historians still argue about the exact timeline and influences on the decline of witchcraft beliefs. Was it purely the rise of science, or were economic changes, political shifts, and changing legal frameworks equally, if not more important? The scientific explanation for weather certainly played a role in eroding the basis for many accusations like causing storms, but it was part of a larger transformation in how society understood misfortune and causality. It wasn't just that science offered an alternative explanation for bad weather. It was that the whole framework of seeing the world through a lens of active, malevolent, supernatural intervention was losing its grip. The slow, steady collection of data, the charting of temperatures and pressures, the mapping of wind patterns. This was the quiet, persistent force that eroded the foundations of fear, built on blaming innocent animals or vulnerable individuals for nature's fury. The weather wasn't a character in a cosmic drama anymore. It was a complex physical process. Joke number 3, which, let's be honest, is still capable of ruining your picnic with the same enthusiasm. But at least you know it's not because your neighbor's cat is secretly a witch's familiar plotting against your potato salad. As the centuries turned, the scientific understanding of the atmosphere continued to grow, eventually leading to sophisticated models and global observation systems. But the crucial first steps were taken back in this era, looking at the sky not with fear of the unseen, but with curiosity about the measurable. The barometer didn't just measure pressure. In a symbolic way, it measured the decline of superstition and the rise of reason. And it certainly didn't care which way Bessie was lying down in the field. So you've landed on the idea that Bessie, or maybe old Buttercup, is somehow messing with the atmospheric pressure, pulling down rain clouds like a furry four-legged puppeteer. You've watched the crops wither, the river swell, or the frost bite harder than a tax collector's smile. You're freezing, you're hungry, and despair is setting in like persistent damp rot in your cottage timbers. What do? You can't exactly call the meteorological office. Even if it existed, your cow ate the pigeon that was supposed to deliver the message. You can't sue the clouds for damages. Your only path, given your belief system, is to deal with the perceived source of the problem, the cow. This is where things move from slightly bonkers belief to genuinely desperate action. Because if you think an animal is responsible for your potential starvation and ruin, you're not just going to shrug and wait for it to stop. You're going to try and intervene. These interventions took the form of folk rituals, charms, and practices aimed directly at the offending animal, or sometimes using parts of the animal in broader weather-influencing rites. Remember that interconnected animistic view of the world we talked about? If the cow is connected to the weather, then influencing the cow should logically influence the weather. It's like trying to fix your Wi-Fi by yelling at your modem. Probably not effective, but it feels like you're doing something. The specific rituals varied wildly depending on the region, the local traditions, and perhaps the creativity born of utter desperation. There wasn't a single universally accepted how to stop your cow from making it rain too much handbook. Instead, it was a patchwork of inherited practices, superstitions, and ad hoc responses. Some of these rituals were relatively gentle, involving blessings or symbolic acts. Others, unfortunately, were less so, reflecting the severity of the perceived threat. Imagine the scene. The sky is still an ominous gray. Perhaps a cold drizzle is making everything miserable, clinging to your face and chilling you to the bone. The fields are waterlogged again. You gather with your family, maybe a few neighbors, around the suspected bovine culprit. The air is thick with tension, a strange mix of fear, anger, and a desperate, fragile hope. Someone might start reciting a traditional charm or prayer, not necessarily one recognized by the official church, but an older invocation passed down through generations, one meant to appease or command the natural forces believed to be at work. These charms might address the cow directly, or perhaps invoke saints associated with weather or livestock, or even older deities whose names lingered in the folk memory. One common thread in sympathetic magic is the idea of using something from the target to influence it, or to influence something else through it. So rituals might involve taking hair clippings from the cow, or a drop of its milk if any was left after the endless rain spoiled the grazing, or even something like manure. These items, having come from the cow, were seen as still intrinsically linked to it. You might burn the hair, throw the milk into a specific well, or toward a specific point on the horizon, or bury the manure with certain incantations. The idea wasn't necessarily to harm the cow, but to symbolically sever its connection to the malevolent weather or redirect its supposed power. It's like unplugging a troublesome appliance. You're just trying to stop it from doing the bad thing. Another approach involves symbolic restraints or bindings. If the cow's weather-making energy was flowing outwards, maybe you could tie it up literally or magically. This could involve tying specific knots and ropes around the cow's legs or horns, while reciting charms or placing symbolic objects around the animal in a circle or specific pattern, creating a sort of magical barrier. You might also see things like burying amulets or blessed objects in the cow's stall, or in the field where it grazes, hoping to counteract its negative influence with positive, protective magic. Sometimes the rituals involved a form of propitiation, trying to ask the cow or the forces working through it to stop. This could mean offering it special fodder, perhaps consecrated in some way, or decorating it with ribbons or herbs believed to have protective or calming properties. You're essentially trying to sweet-talk the creature into switching off the rain machine. Come on, Bessie, just a little sunshine. Please, we'll give you extra clover. However, desperation can breed harsher measures. While historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or isolated incidents driven by extreme hardship and panic, there are accounts or folkloric references that suggest more drastic actions were occasionally taken. If a farmer was truly convinced a specific cow was the source of ruinous weather and gentler methods failed, they might resort to physical harm or even sacrifice. The logic here is brutal but follows the same twisted path. If the cow is the problem, removing or disabling, the cow removes the problem. This wasn't about animal cruelty for its own sake, but a desperate, misguided attempt to save the rest of the herd, the farm, and the family from starvation. Imagine the internal conflict. You depend on this animal, but you believe it's killing you. It's a horrifying bind. These acts, if they occurred, were likely performed in secret, born of shame and fear, as much as anything else. The mainstream historical fact here is that animal sacrifice, while sometimes part of formal religious practice, in ancient times persisted in various forms in folk magic rituals across Europe well into the early modern period, often adapted or disguised to avoid church condemnation. These folk practices weren't always about pleasing a deity. Sometimes they were pragmatic, though misguided attempts to manipulate natural forces or solve perceived problems through symbolic destruction or offering. Let's pause for a moment and remember the context. This is a world where people truly believed in witchcraft, in curses and divine judgment, and in a natural world filled with hidden potent forces. They saw strange lights in the sky, not planes, obviously heard unexplained noises, and lived lives constantly at the mercy of forces they couldn't comprehend. Against this backdrop, performing a ritual involving a cow to stop a storm, as bizarre as it sounds to us, fit within their understanding of how the world worked. It was a form of applied metaphysics, their best attempt at technology to interface with reality's operating system. Think about the sheer psychological burden of this belief. You are utterly reliant on your livestock, seeing them daily tending to their needs, and you simultaneously harbor the terrifying suspicion that one of them is actively trying to destroy you. Every lowing sound might become suspect, every flick of a tail a potential malevolent gesture. The barn, a place of warmth and sustenance, becomes charged with potential danger. It's a constant gnawing anxiety on top of the already backbreaking work of farming. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this despair, some folklore suggested that certain types of cows were more susceptible to being used by witches or other dark forces for weather magic, perhaps ones with unusual markings or horns that grew in strange ways, or even just older, less productive animals that might be viewed with a mix of suspicion and resentment anyway. This added another layer of complexity. It might not be any cow causing the trouble, but a specific one, making the identification process itself fraught with fear and suspicion. Was it the placid brown one, or the one with the wonky horn? The pressure to pick the right culprit must have been immense. The desperation could also manifest in attempts to appeal to higher powers through the cow, perhaps blessing the cow, trying to make it holy or impervious to malevolent influences, or dedicating its milk or butter to a patron saint for good weather. It's a bit like trying to get your divine support ticket fast-tracked by having your pet send the email. Historians still argue whether the documented instances of these cow-related weather rituals were core beliefs held by the majority, or if they were exceptional practices performed by those on the fringes or during times of extreme crisis. Were they remnants of pre-Christian paganism that had survived the centuries, adapted and disguised? Or were they newer superstitions born directly out of the anxieties of the period, particularly the unpredictable climate of the Little Ice Age? The evidence is often patchy. Mentions in court records, perhaps related to accusations of witchcraft, involving livestock folklore collections gathered centuries later, or agricultural manuals that occasionally dismiss or condemn such practices. Piecing together the true extent and nature of these beliefs and rituals is challenging, leaving much open to interpretation and scholarly debate. What is clear, however, is the profound vulnerability of these communities. With no insurance, no government aid beyond perhaps local charity or church relief, which was rarely sufficient during widespread famine and limited scientific understanding, when disaster struck, they were truly on their own. Their only tools were their hands, their faith, and their folk wisdom, however strange it might seem to us. And in that desperate struggle for survival, blaming an animal and trying to ritually control it became a coping mechanism, a way of imposing some kind of order and agency onto a chaotic and terrifying reality. You might not be able to command the winds, but maybe, just maybe, you could command Bessie. You've tried the charms, you've tried the symbolic bindings. Maybe you even seriously considered that less than pleasant option you really didn't want to think about. You've done everything you can think of, everything tradition or desperation suggested to get that cow to turn off the rain or the frost or whatever weather calamity is currently bearing down on you. And the weather often doesn't change. The storm might pass eventually, but was it because of your carefully knotted rope around Buttercup's horn? Or just because, well, that's what weather does? This is the beginning of the end for the cow-blaming era. Not a sudden, dramatic curtain call, but a slow, persistent erosion like a river wearing away a stone over centuries. Because fundamentally, these rituals, these desperate attempts at control, frequently didn't produce the desired immediate and repeatable results. You could blame inadequate ritual performance, lack of faith, or even the cow's sheer stubbornness. But doubt begins to creep in. If tying a red ribbon around Bessie's tail worked last time to bring sunshine for the hay harvest, but this time it just rained harder and the ribbon got soggy, you start to wonder. Maybe it wasn't the ribbon. Maybe it wasn't Bessie. Several powerful currents converged in the 17th and 18th centuries that began to chip away at these older animistic and superstitious beliefs. You're living through a time of tremendous intellectual upheaval, even if you're just a farmer wrestling with soggy fields. The scientific revolution, that slow but inexorable march towards observing, measuring, and understanding the natural world through reason and experiment, is gathering pace. While Newton might be busy figuring out gravity and optics in his study far away, his methods and the spirit of inquiry are starting to permeate educated circles. Think about it. People like Robert Boyle are experimenting with gases, figuring out atmospheric pressure. Others are starting to build better thermometers and barometers. Instruments are being developed that allow for the measurement of weather, not just its observation and fearful interpretation. When you can measure how the pressure is dropping before a storm and see that this happens regardless of what Bessie is doing in the field, it provides an alternative explanation. It might not be an explanation you fully grasp. What even is atmospheric pressure anyway? But the fact that someone else does grasp it and can make increasingly accurate predictions based on these measurements starts to lend weight to a different view of how weather works. Almanacs become more common, not just filled with astrological predictions, though those persist for a long time, but also including observations about seasons, planting, times, and even rudimentary weather forecasts based on past patterns. You start to see connections between wind direction and rain, between temperature changes and frost. This developing understanding, however basic, offers a more logical, less magical framework for explaining why the weather is doing what it's doing. It's easier to accept the wind is from the west bringing rain than the cow is radiating dampness because a witch cursed it. Though admittedly, both sound pretty weird if you're just focused on the soggy boots. The church too played a role, though a complicated one. While the official church often condemned outright superstition and folk magic, seeing it as potentially devilish or simply pagan, it also often provided its own framework for explaining bad weather divine judgment. God was sending the floods or the droughts as punishment for sin. This was arguably just replacing one supernatural explanation with another, but it was an officially sanctioned supernatural explanation. Praying for good weather was encouraged. Performing rituals involving livestock might get you accused of something much worse than poor farming practices, so the pressure was on to adopt explanations that fit within the church's teachings rather than older, more pagan-tinged beliefs. Moreover, the sheer impracticality and the emotional toll of blaming your animals started to wear thin. You depend on these creatures for milk, for meat, for hides, for manure to fertilize those struggling fields. Living in constant suspicion of them performing unsettling rituals, perhaps even harming them in moments of panic. It's exhausting and counterproductive. If the ritual doesn't work and you've alienated the very animal you need to survive the winter, you've just made things worse. It's a bit like blaming your car for traffic and trying to reason with it. Eventually you realize the problem is external, not inherent to the vehicle, unless it's broken down, which is a different issue. As literacy slowly increased, especially in market towns and among the slightly better off farmers, access to printed materials offering more rational explanations grew. Pamphlets, books, and those increasingly popular almanacs spread ideas about natural causes for weather events. This wasn't instant, of course. Information spread slowly, often through word of mouth, filtering down from the educated elite to the general population over generations. But the seed of doubt was planted. Maybe the sky isn't controlled by grumpy cows or mischievous spirits hiding in the barn. A mainstream historical fact here is that the establishment of scientific institutions like the Royal Society in London, founded 1660, and the French Academy of Sciences, founded 1666, explicitly aimed to promote experimental science and gather knowledge about the natural world. While their direct impact on a rural farmer's beliefs about cows and weather might have been delayed, these institutions were foundational in shifting the intellectual climate towards rational inquiry, laying the groundwork for meteorology as a science. Think about the slow, subtle shift. You still pray for rain or sunshine. You still might look for omens in the clouds or the behavior of birds. But when the crops fail, the first thought might shift from, which cow is cursed, to, was there enough fertilizer? Did I plant too early? Was the drainage poor? Practical concerns and observations begin to overlay and eventually partially displace purely magical explanations. It's a process of natural causes slowly gaining ground against perceived supernatural ones. However, these beliefs didn't just vanish overnight like a bad smell after airing out a room. They retreated, lingering particularly in more isolated rural communities, passed down through oral tradition long after they were dismissed as superstition by the educated classes. Historians still argue whether the decline of these specific beliefs was primarily driven by the rise of science, the influence of the church promoting its own explanations, or simply the gradual accumulation of empirical evidence from farmers' own experiences showing the rituals didn't consistently work. It was likely a complex interplay of all these factors operating at different speeds in different places. A quirky or fringe tidbit illustrating the persistence of some magical thinking, even as cow blame faded, is the continued belief in things like weather houses, small models with figures that would come out depending on humidity, interpreted as forecasting rain or sun. These were proto-hygrometers based on natural phenomena, but they were often presented and understood in a way that blurred the lines between scientific principle and folk magic, a tangible link to the idea that everyday objects or figures could somehow know the weather. It's like getting your weather forecast from a garden gnome with a tiny barometer. Practical, but still a bit whimsical. The transition wasn't always smooth. As scientific ideas filtered down, they could be misinterpreted or blended with existing beliefs. You might hear about atmospheric pressure from a traveling salesman, but still believe a cow's flatulence influences it. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but you get the idea. New information doesn't always replace old. It can just get folded in awkwardly. The world remained a place full of mystery where strange events still needed explanation. If it wasn't the cow, maybe it was the fairies or a neighbor's curse. The focus of anxiety might shift, but the underlying need to understand and control an unpredictable environment remained. So while you might still eye that one particularly moody-looking cow with a sliver of suspicion during a sudden hailstorm, the deep-seated conviction that it's the source of the problem addressable through folk ritual begins to wane. You start relying more on accumulated farming wisdom on observing the natural world with a slightly more practical eye, and perhaps on those increasingly helpful, if sometimes wrong, almanacs. The idea of Bessie as a four-legged weather machine starts to feel less like terrifying reality and more like, well, a bit of an old wives' tale. It becomes something your grandmother believed, something from a time when the world felt a little smaller, a little more magical, and a lot more terrifying, because you had even fewer tools to understand it. The age of blaming Bessie for the bad weather is slowly, inevitably drawing to a close, making way for new anxieties and new, slightly more scientific ways of explaining the world's frustrations. The creak of the barn door, the lowing of a cow, the scent of hay and manure. These things are still part of your life, central to your survival. But the meaning you attach to them is subtly shifting. The fear, the intense, visceral dread that a single moody cow might deliberately conjure a blizzard or withhold the life-giving rain is slowly, gradually dissipating. It's not like a light switch being flipped off. It's more like a thick fog slowly burning off as the sun rises. Patches of it linger clinging to the hollows and forgotten corners of the landscape and the mind, but the overall clarity is improving. You might still have an elderly relative who mutters about bewitched cattle when the milk sours unexpectedly, or who insists that a specific cow brings bad luck. These beliefs haven't vanished into thin air. They've retreated, becoming less of a widely held explanation for major weather events, and more like isolated superstitions, personal quirks, or quaint and sometimes inconvenient remnants of a fading worldview. They are no longer the primary lens through which you understand why the hail just flattened your barley crop. Instead, your worries are beginning to take on a slightly different shape. You worry about the clouds, yes, but increasingly in terms of their physical characteristics, how dark they are, how fast they're moving, which direction the wind is blowing them from. You're looking at the sky with a farmer's eye honed by generations of observation, but now perhaps informed by snippets of information from those newfangled almanacs or overheard conversations in the market about barometers. The slow march of what will eventually become modern meteorology is underway, even if you only see its distant effects. People are starting to systematically record weather patterns. They're developing instruments to measure temperature, pressure, wind speed. It's no longer just about interpreting signs or performing rituals. It's about collecting data. This fundamental shift from interpretation, chart intervention, to measurement, analysis, is key to leaving the age of blaming Bessie behind. It's like going from trying to appease a grumpy god to trying to understand the gears of a machine. Both can feel overwhelming, but one offers the possibility of prediction and understanding in a way the other simply doesn't. As this understanding grows, the need to find a magical or supernatural scapegoat for bad weather diminishes. It's hard to maintain the conviction that a cow is causing a drought when someone can show you charts correlating low rainfall across a wide region with persistent high-pressure systems. High-pressure systems might not sound as dramatic as a cow cursed by a witch, but they offer a more consistent, repeatable explanation for why your well is drying up. It's less about who to blame and more about what is happening in the atmosphere. The economic realities of farming also push you towards more practical explanations. Your livelihood depends on predictable weather patterns, or at least on understanding the probability of certain patterns. If you invest in draining a field, you want to know if it will make a difference in preventing future flooding, regardless of what Old Man Hemlock says about his neighbor's cow having the water sickness. Your focus shifts to improving soil quality, selecting hardier crops, managing water resources and timing your planting and harvest based on observed seasonal variations and increasingly informed forecasts rather than on the phases of the moon or the behavior of your livestock. This isn't to say that anxieties about weather vanish. Far from it, they just evolve. Instead of worrying about which animal is causing the storm, you worry about whether the harvest will be large enough to feed your family and pay your landlord. You worry about market prices fluctuating wildly due to regional weather disasters you can't control. You worry about unpredictable extremes, killer frosts, prolonged heat waves, devastating floods, precisely because they are becoming better documented and understood as natural, albeit disruptive phenomena. The fear shifts from the source, magical cow, to the consequences, ruined crops, famine, poverty. A mainstream historical fact marking this transition is the systematic collection of meteorological data beginning in earnest in the late 17th and 18th centuries. For example, the first weather observations were regularly recorded in Oxford, starting in 1654, and by the early 18th century, networks of observers using standardized instruments were starting to emerge in various European countries. These early weather logs, though rudimentary by modern standards, were foundational for understanding climate patterns and developing the science of meteorology, providing a basis for explanations that didn't involve livestock or witchcraft. Think of it as the beginning of weather reports that weren't just based on looking out the window and crossing your fingers. The church's influence continued to shape the acceptable narrative around weather. While folk magic was increasingly suppressed, divine intervention remained a potent explanation for both good and bad weather for a long time. You might still pray for rain or give thanks for a good harvest, attributing it to God's grace rather than a cow's malevolence or your own careful farming practices alone. This provided a theological framework that offered comfort in a sense of order while still displacing the older animistic beliefs about animals and nature spirits. It was a different kind of supernatural explanation, one that fit better within the dominant cultural structure. Education, however limited it was for most rural populations, played a crucial role. As basic literacy improved, more people could access printed materials that offered alternative explanations for natural phenomena. Almanacs, as mentioned before, slowly shifted from being primarily astrological guides to including practical information on agriculture and weather patterns. Even if you couldn't read yourself, information filtered down from those who could, challenging the older ways of thinking. It's like hearing about the internet for the first time from your city cousin. Confusing, maybe a little scary, but clearly representing a different way of doing things. The sheer absurdity of some of the old beliefs when viewed through a slightly more rational lens also contributed to their decline. Trying to physically punish an animal for the weather or performing elaborate, often nonsensical rituals likely felt increasingly desperate and ineffective in a world where other forms of knowledge and control were emerging. It's hard to maintain a straight face while explaining that tying knots in a rope will stop the wind, especially when the wind stubbornly continues to blow. Historians still argue whether the decline of specific folk beliefs like cow blaming for weather was primarily driven by top-down forces like the rise of science and the church's condemnation of superstition, or bottom-up processes, farmers' own empirical observations proving the rituals ineffective, and the increasing focus on practical farming techniques. It was likely a complex interplay with different forces being more dominant in different regions and at different times. The change wasn't a uniform wave washing over the land, but a patchwork of shifts and resistances. A quirky or fringe tidbit that shows how magical thinking about weather persisted but often in different forms, is the continued belief in things like sympathetic magic related to weather. For instance, burying certain objects to influence rainfall or carrying a specific plant to ward off lightning. These practices weren't directly blaming livestock, but still operated on the principle that you could influence vast natural forces through small symbolic actions. It's a bit like wearing your lucky socks to make sure it doesn't rain on your picnic. Harmless, but definitely not meteorology. Ultimately, the cow blaming faded because it became increasingly incompatible with both the emerging scientific understanding of weather and the practical demands of farming in a changing world. As you navigated the late 17th and early 18th centuries, your focus shifted from trying to control the weather by manipulating your animals to trying to understand the weather so you could better prepare for it and mitigate its effects through improved farming techniques. The cow transformed in the collective mind from a potential source of supernatural peril into primarily what it was: a valuable source of food labor and manure. Subject to the whims of nature, just like you were not the orchestrator of them. The era of blaming Bessie for the bad weather draws to a close, not with a bang, but with a slow sigh of resignation and a growing sense of practicality. The fears about the weather remain, perhaps even intensify, as you become more aware of the large-scale forces at play, but the target of that fear and the methods for dealing with it have fundamentally changed. You still look up at the sky, but now you're looking for clouds that indicate rain, not cows that radiate dampness. And honestly, that's probably a lot less stressful for everyone involved, especially Bessie. The story drifts now like leaves on a slow stream, the sharp edges of the past softening. You've walked through muddy fields, felt the biting wind peered into fearful eyes, both human and bovine. That weight of ancient worries, the struggle to make sense of a world that felt both deeply personal and terrifyingly vast. You can let that go now. The farmers and their cows fade back into the mists of time, their fears giving way to different fears, their rituals to different ways of understanding. Breathe softly. The rain or the sun, the frost or the thaw, moves according to its own slow, indifferent rhythms now. No longer tied to the fate of a creature in a barn, just the quiet hum of the world settling and the slow drift towards sleep.